Greetings, fellow night owls, and welcome to tonight's soothing journey back in time. I'm truly delighted that you've joined me for another exploration of our shared history. This evening, we'll delve into the intricate and winding road that culminated in the fall of one of the mightiest empires the world has ever witnessed, the Roman Empire. Before we start, I'd be curious to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Feel free to drop a comment and share. Are you snuggled up in bed after a long day preparing to drift off? Or maybe you're seeking some tranquility and relaxation while you're still awake? No matter what, it's a privilege to guide you on this historical expedition. If you appreciate rich, soothing storytelling that beautifully intertwines captivating history with a calming narration, I invite you to subscribe. We have many more intriguing tales from our past lined up for future episodes, but for now, let's gently direct our focus to ancient Rome. Close your eyes and envision yourself transported back more than 2,000 years. Imagine the energetic streets of Rome at the pinnacle of its power and glory. The splendid marble temples and monuments sparkling in the Mediterranean sunlight. The forum alive with the dialogue of politicians, merchants, and regular citizens going about their daily routines. Powerful legions marching out from the city gates, destined to extend the empire's reach to the farthest corners of the known world. It might have seemed during those radiant years that Rome was everlasting, that its wealth, power, and indefatigable spirit could never be shattered. Yet even the strongest of empires are subject to decline, and Rome was no exception. The narrative of Rome's fall is intricate and lengthy, encompassing centuries of conflicts, political maneuverings, economic turmoil, and significant social and religious transformations. There was no singular reason, no decisive strike, but rather a gradual disintegration as fissures emerged in the very bedrock of Roman influence and esteem. In the hours ahead, we will meander through the intricate narrative of Rome's fall, taking moments to reflect on pivotal events and individuals that forged its fate. We will encounter emperors, both astute and foolish, generals, both brave and arrogant, along with a dynamic array of everyday Romans navigating through remarkable eras. So find a comfortable spot, breathe slowly and deeply, and allow the contemporary world to fade away as we set off on our expedition back through the misty corridors of history to investigate the waning years of the once formidable Roman Empire. Our tale commences in the final years of the 2nd century AD. Externally, the empire seemed to be at the zenith of its might and stability. Its borders were well guarded, the economy flourished, and a sequence of wise and skilled leaders known as the 5 Good Emperors had ushered in a period of peace and prosperity. Yet beneath this guise of invulnerable strength, hairline fractures were beginning to appear in the essence of Roman authority. These minuscule breaks would eventually multiply and expand until the previously solid foundation of the empire disintegrated entirely. One of the earliest indicators of impending trouble was a gradual yet persistent decline in the power and effectiveness of the imperial throne itself. For generations, the empire had been steered by a line of rulers who exemplified the solemn discipline and civic virtue recognized as quintessentially Roman traits. However, as the 2nd century came to a close, a new type of emperor began to rise. These were men more fascinated by the allure and indulgences of power than the demanding responsibilities of governance. A notably infamous figure among these emerging rulers was Commodus, the son and successor of the esteemed philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Commodus assumed power in 177 AD at the mere age of 19. While his father exemplified wisdom and duty, Commodus emerged as a self-absorbed and whimsical young man who prioritized the praise of the masses over the significant duties of ruling an empire. He took on the persona of a gladiator, often entering the arena to battle against fearful adversaries who had been ordered to yield to the emperor's blows. He renamed the city of Rome as Colonia Commodana, the colony of Commodus, and even altered the names of the months to reflect his various titles and accolades. As Commodus pursued his self-indulgences and ignored governmental responsibilities, the once sturdy pillars of imperial power began to fracture and decline. The Senate, which historically acted as a counterbalance to the emperor's excesses, found itself more and more marginalized and disregarded. The military, recognizing the vulnerabilities at the heart of the empire, started to assert its own authority. In 192 AD, following over 10 years of mismanagement, Commodus was ultimately assassinated in a coup within the palace. Nevertheless, his demise did little to restore order or dignity to the imperial position. In the years that followed, Rome would become embroiled in a succession of fleeting and often violently overthrown emperors, as various factions among the military and Senate vied for supremacy. This relentless cycle of assassination and change escalated dramatically with the emergence of the Praetorian Guard, the personal protectors of the emperor. Initially established to safeguard the emperor, the Praetorians soon transformed into a power-brokering force in their own right, installing and deposing rulers at will in exchange for bribes and political concessions. Within a mere 16 years, from 235 to 251 AD, no fewer than 20 emperors claimed the throne, many only lasting a few months before being eliminated by their own guards or competing claimants. The once venerable dignity of the imperial office had deteriorated into little more than a vacant crown to be purchased, traded, or forcibly seized. However, the decay afflicting Rome during these times was not limited to the imperial palace alone. Even while the political framework of the empire was splintering, its economic foundations began to waver as well. For many centuries, the affluence and might of Rome was supported by a solid system of agriculture, commerce, and tributes from subjugated regions. However, as the 3rd century commenced, this once thriving economy began to exhibit signs of distress. In the rural areas, centuries of extensive farming had started to deplete the soil's fertility, resulting in diminishing crop outputs and the gradual neglect of previously fruitful farms. Within the urban centers, the continuous devaluation of silver currency by a series of financially strapped emperors resulted in rampant inflation and a growing distrust in the monetary system. Moreover, along the empire's borders, persistent pressure from hostile tribes and competing powers compelled Rome to allocate ever-increasing resources to maintaining its front lines. These were resources that could have otherwise bolstered the domestic economy. This escalating economic distress only compounded the prevailing feelings of instability and decline that permeated every aspect of Roman life. While the grand facade of the empire might still appear imposing from a distance, and the legions continued their marches, and the monuments still sparkled up close, the fractures in the facade were becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. It's essential to understand that these fractures did not emerge overnight, nor were their far-reaching consequences immediately apparent to those experiencing these tumultuous times. The deterioration of Rome unfolded slowly and subtly over generations. Many Romans undoubtedly continued with their daily routines as they always had, devoting themselves to their trades, caring for their families, celebrating festivals, and lamenting losses, largely shielded from the profound shifts occurring beneath the surface. Yet with the advantage of retrospect, we can recognize the early signs of Rome's eventual downfall taking root during this time of gradual dysfunction and uncertainty. The once steadfast structure of Roman authority was already starting to crack, even while the empire extended its borders and showcased its might globally. In the upcoming moments, we will observe how these initial vulnerabilities would evolve into vast divides as the Roman realm faced an onslaught of invasions, rebellions, and internal unrest. Along this journey, we will encounter emperors and usurpers, saints and barbarians who would influence the fate of Rome in its last centuries. As we delve into these chaotic times, I encourage you to keep a vision of Rome at its pinnacle in your thoughts. The Rome of Augustus and Trajan, of Cicero and Virgil. The Rome that constructed roads and aqueducts that still stand today, which gifted us legal and governance systems that continue to shape our world in deep and subtle manners. That Rome, the everlasting city atop the 7 hills, the Caput Mundi, the epicenter of the world, may seem alarmingly distant now, separated from our contemporary existence by an unfathomable chasm of years. Yet in the brief flickers of our historical imagination, we can still glimpse its diminished splendor. Thus, as we gracefully navigate through these subsequent chapters in Rome's protracted decline, let us honor the remarkable achievements of the Roman Empire and the frail, imperfect individuals who lived and contended within its expansive reach, not so different from you or I. With this in mind, let us gently transition into the rich and dreamlike expanse of Rome's history and immerse ourselves in the enthralling narrative of its decline. As the first fissures begin to fracture the sturdy foundation of the empire, I will be right here, my voice a comforting constant, guiding you through the intricate tapestry of characters and occurrences. There's no need to force yourself to remember every detail. Simply let the tale envelop you and allow your imagination to conjure vivid images of this lost world. And should you ever find your eyelids becoming drowsy or your thoughts drifting away, remember that it's perfectly fine to allow yourself to gently slip into sleep. The narrative will patiently await your return. So, now close your eyes. The wonders of ancient Rome to unfold around you. Visualize the grand marble pillars and majestic triumphal arches, with golden eagles perched on vibrant red banners billowing in the breeze. Listen to the far-off sound of legionary footsteps, the laughter and dialogue of the bustling forum, and the clash of swords as gladiators engage in combat within the arena. As this imagery comes to life and our adventure commences, take comfort in knowing that you are among friends. Each of us, in our own unique way, are heirs to the rich heritage of Rome, its victories, its downfalls, its wisdom, and its foolishness. By delving into the story of this long-lost empire's rise and decline, we are, in a way, investigating the very foundations of our own civilization, the intricate, intertwining roots from which much of our contemporary world has flourished. This is a heritage we carry with us, whether consciously or unconsciously, manifested in the language we speak, the laws we follow, the roads we traverse, and the tales we share, a legacy so vast and enduring that it can at times be overwhelming to fully grasp its breadth and majesty. Yet tonight, as we embark on this journey through the dimming dusk of Rome, we have a moment to step back and appreciate the sweeping drama of this civilization's arc, to feel the weight of countless years resting upon us, even as they elevate us with their sense of wonder. So let us commence, you and I, at this pivotal point in Rome's history, with the empire still cloaked in the splendor of its might, yet with the first signs of deterioration already emerging. The path ahead will be long and complex, scattered with the remnants of warfare and shimmering glory. However, I assure you, by the end of our voyage, we will have witnessed the very essence of a civilization exposed, in both its magnificence and its melancholy. Content advisory. This script includes a brief, non-graphic mention of violence. As the tumult of the 3rd century finally began to wane, and a weary Rome paused to recuperate under Diocletian's leadership, fresh challenges were emerging on the horizon. The vastness and prosperity of the empire had long drawn envious gazes from tribes and groups living beyond the Danube and Rhine rivers. Entities such as the Goths, Vandals, Saxons, and Franks had been in conflict with Rome for centuries. Roman forces would regularly cross the borders to subdue and pacify these so-called barbarians, either assimilating them into the empire or utilizing them as a buffer against more distant threats. Yet now the dynamics were shifting. As we've noted, the turmoil of the 3rd century had significantly weakened the Roman military. Legions that once appeared unconquerable now found it challenging to fend off increasingly audacious raids and incursions from Germanic warriors. Gradually, the military balance was tilting. Barbarian war bands were evolving into formidable tribal kingdoms with advanced political organizations and capable leadership. They observed Rome's diminishing control over its frontier provinces and recognized a chance to strike. As the 4th century approached, one tribe in particular would rise to become Rome's most formidable rival. The Goths, an East Germanic group, had migrated from southern Scandinavia to the region north of the Black Sea during the early 1st millennium AD. For nearly 100 years, they had been a well-known presence along the lower Danube, at times clashing with the Romans as foes and at other times allying with the emperors. In the early 300s, the Goths split into 2 branches, the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east. Their ascendance would be accelerated by an imminent threat emerging from the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns were a nomadic people whose origins and ethnic composition remain largely enigmatic. It's evident that their aggressive advance toward the west in the late 300s initiated a series of events that would profoundly disrupt an already unstable Roman landscape. In an effort to escape the Hunnic invasion, the Visigoths requested authorization to traverse the Danube border and establish a settlement within the empire. In a pivotal decision, Emperor Valens consented, permitting the tribe to take root in the Balkans in 376. This choice was made more out of necessity than camaraderie. Valens believed that the Goths could act as a front-line defense against the Huns, while also providing a ready source of recruits for the chronically understaffed legions. Yet any notion of a straightforward partnership quickly disintegrated. Upon crossing the river, the Goths faced severe mistreatment from the local Roman officials. Fueled by hunger and resentment over their poor reception, the tribe rebelled. The situation culminated in 378 with the pivotal Battle of Adrianople. Leading a formidable army, Emperor Valens set out with confidence to crush the Gothic insurgents. However, amidst the parched plains near the city, the Romans suffered a disastrous defeat. Surrounded by Gothic cavalry, the imperial forces were annihilated. Valens met his end in the carnage, marking the first time an emperor fell in confrontation with a barbarian adversary. The aftermath of Adrianople sent shockwaves throughout the empire. The Eastern Roman military was severely weakened, allowing the Goths to freely raid the Balkan regions. This was a foreboding foreshadowing of what lay ahead. Numerous other tribes now rushed to take advantage of Rome's precarious situation. On the final day of 406, a colossal coalition of Alans, Vandals, and Suebi surged across the Rhine, breaching Roman defences. Like a mighty tide, the Germanic invaders inundated Gaul, Hispania, and other once secure territories. What had once seemed unimaginable was now within reach. After centuries of fending off barbarian threats, the borders had utterly crumbled. Territories that had been part of the Roman realm for over 500 years now came under the dominance of Germanic monarchs and military leaders. The Goths, in contrast, surged from victory to victory. After wandering for years throughout the Balkan lands, they were now guided by a talented young king named Alaric, a clever strategist trained in Roman warfare. All Alaric aspired to was to secure a lasting homeland for his people. In 408, the Visigoths attacked Italy, the very heart of the empire. Following 2 grueling sieges, Alaric's forces stood at Rome's gates. The Senate, which once commanded kings and dictated the fates of nations, found itself reduced to sending a disgraceful plea for mercy. They promised that the great city would be spared if Alaric accepted their meagre bribe of gold, silver, silk, scarlet fabric, and pepper. As historian Zosimus recounts, Alaric burst into laughter at this proposal, cleverly remarking, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed." He insisted on a far more substantial ransom, leaving the Romans with no option but to comply, although it only granted them a temporary delay. In 410, the Visigoths made their return. This time, rebellious slaves flung the gates wide open, allowing the city to fall to the invaders. Alaric's forces flooded into the capital, wreaking havoc as they pillaged. For the first time in nearly 800 years, Rome had succumbed to a foreign foe. The impact was immense, leading to profound soul-searching among the empire's elite. "It is my prayer, dearest son," wrote Saint Jerome in the aftermath, "that you may dwell among these things as a pilgrim, a sojourner, a citizen of Jerusalem, not of Babylon. Our tears are dried by the thought that God has spared us to warn others." Though the city itself still stood, Rome's fall represented a pivotal moment. In a world where the rise and fall of civilizations were often viewed as divine judgment, many considered it a sign of divine neglect, a retribution for the empire's moral failings. The sack by the Visigoths was far from the final humiliation that the beleaguered Romans would encounter. In 429, the Vandals, led by their king Genseric, launched an invasion of North Africa, effectively wresting control of the province from the empire. This represented a significant strategic defeat. North Africa, with its lush agricultural fields, had long served as the breadbasket of the Western Empire. The essential grain shipments from this region nourished the growing populations of Rome and other urban centers. With that territory lost, the heartland of the empire faced severe food shortages. The forfeiture of Africa also entailed losing the considerable taxes and revenues that had previously flowed from that area into the imperial treasury. Already struggling under the weight of invaders' plunder, Rome's economy spiraled into turmoil. With its financial resources decimated, crops devastated, and borders under threat, the Western Empire's situation became increasingly precarious. The Vandals' capture of Carthage in 439 effectively signaled the end of Roman rule in North Africa. Though its broken remnants would linger for another 30 years, the West was rapidly heading toward disaster. As the 5th century approached its midpoint, the position of the Western throne had devolved into a grim version of musical chairs. A swift succession of emperors attempted but failed to halt the empire's decline. In 475, a general named Orestes took control of the court in Ravenna and appointed his young son Romulus as emperor. The child ruler would be derisively referred to as Romulus Augustulus, or Little Augustus. In an ironic twist of fate, the last emperor of Rome was named after both the city's mythical founder and the one who had initiated the imperial era. Surprisingly, young Romulus would also unwittingly be the one to bring that era to a close. His time in power would be brief, more like a poignant footnote than a genuine effort to revive Western imperial glory. In 476, Orestes declined the demands of his barbarian mercenaries for land in Italy. Their reaction was swift and resolute. The Germanic general Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes in combat, then advanced on Ravenna. In a final act of humiliation, Romulus Augustulus was compelled to relinquish the throne. Some sources suggest that Odoacer, feeling compassion for the young ruler, spared his life and allowed him a comfortable existence in exile on a rural estate. With this anticlimactic conclusion, the tumultuous history of the Western Roman Empire came to an abrupt end. Odoacer declared himself the King of Italy, governing the region on behalf of his benefactor, the Eastern Emperor Zeno. However, the story of Rome was not finished. The Eastern Empire, which began to be recognized as the Byzantine Empire, would persist for nearly another 1,000 years, ultimately succumbing to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Moreover, the vision of a universal European empire, first heralded by Augustus many centuries earlier, would continue to captivate monarchs and conquerors for generations. Nevertheless, the aspiration for a unified Roman Empire, a singular state embracing the entirety of the Mediterranean, had come to an end. Rome, the eternal city on its 7 hills, would transition into the realm of nostalgic legend, a dim recollection of former glories eternally longed for, yet never reclaimed. Thus, in this reflective moment, we consider the lengthy and winding road that carried the Romans to their final outcome. In recounting their decline and fall, what insights might we glean for our own society? Perhaps first and foremost, Rome serves as a cautionary reminder about the perils of imperial arrogance. At the pinnacle of its strength, Rome's reign appeared everlasting and unassailable. The sheer magnitude and reach of the empire led its leaders to become complacent, blind to the fissures developing in the very bedrock of their civilization. They neglected to confront the deep-seated forces gradually undermining Roman strength, the legitimacy crisis that eroded the imperial authority, the growing divide between the affluent and the impoverished, the slow decay of civic responsibility and martial ability. They neglected to confront the deep-seated forces gradually undermining Roman strength, the legitimacy crisis that eroded the imperial authority, the growing divide between the affluent and the impoverished, the slow decay of civic responsibility and martial ability. In their hubris, they believed that the barbarian tribes would eternally remain disorderly inferiors, lured by the magnificence of Rome and satisfied with their position in its shadow. They could not foresee that the communities on their fringes would eventually surpass them in might and replace them as the rulers of the world. For centuries, Rome flourished through relentless conquest and expansion, continuously striving to extend its borders. However, over time, that vast expanse transformed into a vulnerability rather than an asset, an unmanageable territory to patrol and defend. Yet, as Rome withdrew from the annals of history, its influence persisted. It carried on in the grandeur of Constantinople, the towering structures of medieval cathedrals, and in the Latin language that continued to be Europe's common tongue for scholarship and governance. It influenced the art, philosophy, and institutions that would lay the foundation for Western civilization. The successors of Rome may have adopted new deities and languages, but they still drew direction and inspiration from the ancient empire's diminished glories. Even the Renaissance, that grand revival of art and learning, regarded itself as the renewal of a classical ideal that had never fully faded. So rest now, dear friends, and reflect on the long-ago journey of a civilization that once appeared everlasting. When morning breaks, its structures will still stand as silent witnesses to the heights humanity can achieve, and its fractured and eroded ruins will softly remind us of the perils of taking such magnificence for granted, as well as the fleeting nature of even the most formidable creations of man. The Goths had dealt a devastating defeat at Adrianople, yet they were merely one among many tribes gathering along Rome's borders. The Vandals, Saxons, and Franks, names that would soon be etched into the Roman consciousness, were also stirring, testing for vulnerabilities in the empire's defences. These Germanic tribes had long been a constant irritation to Rome. For hundreds of years, the Romans attempted to manage the Germanic tribes through a combination of incentives and force, engaging in trade at times, while at others, resorting to military action to push them back across the Rhine and Danube rivers. However, like an unstoppable wave, the pressure from these tribes continued to increase, and the already stretched Roman legions simply couldn't cover every location. Compounding the situation, Rome was preoccupied with threats arising in other regions. To the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire consistently posed a challenge which compelled Rome to divide its military resources. Then, in the late 300s AD, a formidable new force emerged from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. These formidable nomadic fighters, celebrated for their outstanding horsemanship and precise skills with the composite bow, began advancing westward, displacing various tribes as they progressed. Initially, the Huns did not assault Rome directly, but their migrations triggered a domino effect, pushing more and more Germanic groups against Rome's frontiers. This mounting pressure finally resulted in a significant breakthrough in 406 AD. That frigid winter, the Rye River froze solid. When spring arrived, the melting ice wreaked havoc on Roman fortifications along the banks. Tens of thousands of Germanic tribespeople, including Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, surged across the Rhine en masse, spreading out throughout the Roman province of Gaul. The already vulnerable Western Empire would never recover from this devastating blow. In 410, the Visigoths, led by their astute king Alaric, besieged Rome itself. For the first time in nearly 800 years, barbarians breached the mighty city's defenses. The sack of Rome reverberated throughout the empire, marking a stark psychological turning point. If Rome could be vulnerable, no place was secure. However, the humiliation of the Eternal City was just beginning. In 455, the Vandals, who had established a kingdom in North Africa, came knocking. Under the command of their formidable leader, Genseric, the Vandals landed at Ostia and spent a fortnight systematically looting Rome of its wealth. Invaluable gemstones, gold and silver artifacts, even the gilded bronze tiles from the Temple of Jupiter were carted away to embellish Genseric's palaces in Carthage. The term vandalism originates from the memory of their ruthless pillaging. The Vandals' conquest of North Africa proved particularly catastrophic for the Western Empire. For centuries, the fertile regions that constitute modern Tunisia and Algeria had been the breadbasket for Rome's bustling population. This area provided essential grain shipments that kept the capital nourished and satisfied. With that land lost and the shipping routes under Vandal dominance, Rome found it increasingly difficult to replenish its granaries. Hunger became an ever-present companion alongside fear for the once proud Romans. As external threats and internal strife besieged the empire, Rome's power gradually disintegrated in a piecemeal fashion. Gaul fell into the hands of the Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes divided up Britain, while the Vandals took control of North Africa. The Western emperors remained clinging to Italy, but their situation became increasingly fragile. The extensive territorial losses led to a sharp decline in tax revenue, funds that the empire critically needed to compensate its soldiers and support its various operations. To address the fiscal shortfall, Roman mints resorted to debasing the currency by reducing the silver content in the coins. Unfortunately, this move instigated severe inflation, further undermining public trust. With the economy in chaos, borders overrun, and the illusion of invincibility irreparably damaged, by the late 400s AD, the Western Roman Empire had become a mere shadow of its former glory. All that was needed was one final slip to bring this decaying relic crashing down, and that gust of wind was already stirring from the east, stirring the golden banners of the Huns as their most notorious leader set his sights on Rome. His name still sends chills down spines even today. Attila, the scourge of God. Emerging from a prominent family among the Huns, Attila ascended to power in the early 400s alongside his brother Bleda. Initially, the two siblings co-ruled, extracting immense tribute from a weakened Eastern Roman Empire. However, Attila grew discontent with the shared power and riches. In 445, he assassinated his brother, taking full control of the Hunnic military apparatus. As the unquestioned ruler of the steppes, Attila initiated a wave of aggressive raids and conquests that extended his empire's reach from the Caspian Sea to the Rhine. A brilliant strategist and adept at psychological warfare, he wielded fear as a formidable weapon. The ferocity and swiftness of his assaults instilled terror wherever he moved. It was said that wherever Attila traversed, grass would no longer thrive. In 452, his horde of nomadic cavalry, possibly numbering around 500,000, surged across the Alps and into Italy, heading straight for Rome. As Attila ravaged the Po Valley, the Western Emperor Valentinian III could do nothing but witness the devastation from his sanctuary in Ravenna. With the Vandals controlling the seas and his borders stripped of legions, Valentinian was powerless to halt the Huns' progress. Yet fate intervened at the threshold of Rome. According to legend, Pope Leo I personally confronted Attila, convincing him to spare the city. More plausibly, Attila's retreat was due to an outbreak of disease within his forces and troubles brewing on his eastern frontiers. Regardless of the reason, the Huns withdrew, but not before Attila secured a promise of marriage to Valentinian's sister, Honoria, along with a substantial dowry. It seemed that the once mighty Roman emperor had been reduced to negotiating with a barbarian king. Attila didn't have long to enjoy his victory. In 453, shortly after marrying another young bride, the Hunnic leader suffered a fatal nosebleed on his wedding night. He choked to death in a stupor, marking an undignified end for a man who had instilled fear across empires. With the death of Attila, the threat posed by the Huns diminished rapidly. His heirs engaged in fierce disputes over the succession, while the vassals of the Huns asserted their independence, causing the tribal confederation to fracture. By this stage, however, the damage inflicted on Rome was irreversible. The Western Empire had become a mere shadow of its former self, its emperor reduced to a symbolic figure. The once formidable army was now largely composed of barbarian mercenaries. Fittingly, the last ruler of the West was named Romulus Augustulus, which echoed Rome's founder and its first emperor. Yet, the parallels ended there. Romulus Augustulus was practically a puppet, a pawn caught in the power struggles among barbarian leaders. His father, Orestes, a former secretary of Attila, had usurped control of the imperial government in 475 AD. In an attempt to placate his barbarian soldiers, Orestes promised them land grants in Italy, but the Western Empire scarcely had any land left to offer. When Orestes failed to honor his promise, simmering discontent erupted into open rebellion. The Germanic mercenaries united under one of their own, a chieftain named Odoacer. In 476, Odoacer's forces seized and executed Orestes, then advanced upon Ravenna, where they discovered the young Emperor Romulus cowering in his palace. In a final act of humiliation, Odoacer stripped the imperial insignia from the boy and sent him into comfortable exile in Campania. The Western Roman Empire had finally met its end. This fall sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world. The Eastern Roman Empire, the segment of the empire that had long looked down upon their Latin counterparts, now found itself standing alone against the currents of history. In a symbolic gesture, the Eastern Emperor Zeno abolished the title of Western Emperor, declaring himself the sole ruler of a unified Roman realm, even as that realm crumbled around him. Paradoxically, even the barbarians who had toppled the Western Empire seemed to acknowledge some semblance of Rome's majesty. Many of these leaders persisted in minting coins that featured the likeness of the emperor and ruling in the emperor's name, even though their reigns were merely a faint echo of imperial magnificence. It appeared that the essence of Rome could not be entirely snuffed out. The empire left an indelible mark on the collective European psyche. Its language, Latin, remained the principal medium for education and religious ceremonies for many centuries. Its legal principles laid the groundwork for civil law throughout the continent. The literature, philosophy, and artistry of Rome established benchmarks that endured for more than a millennium. Even the city of Rome, ravaged and depopulated, draped itself in the allure of its former greatness. As Europe slipped into the Dark Ages, scholars and historians gazed back with a mix of reverence and nostalgia at the lost brilliance of the Eternal City. Eventually, a new Western Roman emperor would emerge, this time donning the crown of a Germanic monarchy that traced its lineage back to the conquests of Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be recognized, was a deliberate endeavor to reignite the splendors of Rome, though, as Voltaire humorously noted, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. For over a millennium, the shadow of Rome loomed large over the West. Meanwhile, as the East upheld the torch through the Byzantine Empire, focused around Constantine's shining capital of Constantinople, the Byzantines, who proudly identified as Romans, safeguarded the arts, literature, and governance of Greco-Roman civilization for centuries following the fall of the Western Empire. The stunning mosaics of Hagia Sophia, the golden treasures of Byzantine iconography, and the detailed court rituals of the emperors, all these reflected the magnificence that had once characterized Rome. Even after Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the aspiration for a restored Roman Empire lingered in the minds of European rulers and intellectuals. The Russian Tsars declared Moscow the Third Rome, assuming the legacy of the Byzantine emperors. The British like to envision themselves as the modern successors of Rome, a vast empire that embodies law and civilization. Mussolini, akin to a Caesar, hailed the magnificence of ancient Rome while striving to rejuvenate Italy's former glory. In the stately chambers of Washington, D.C., swingingly fledgling republic intentionally patterned itself after the republican principles of Rome, all while navigating the complexities of imperial power. Ultimately, though, the real inheritance of Rome may reside less in its military triumphs or imperial grandeur, and more in the cautionary narrative of its downfall, a stark warning about the perils of corruption, overextension, and the gradual decline of civic responsibility. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not merely the consequence of a single disaster, it was a prolonged, gradual disintegration, a death from countless minor wounds. This story serves as a sobering reflection for any society that has become complacent or overly assured of its own importance. Even the strongest of empires, as Rome illustrates, can falter if they become detached from the principles and virtues that fostered their greatness. As we have observed, the roots of Rome's end were established early amid the escalating decadence and corruption of its ruling class, the increasing wealth disparity, and the slow decay of traditional values and institutions. These internal frailties left Rome fragile and sensitive to external pressures, such as the military crises of the 3rd century and the barbarian incursions of the 4th and 5th centuries. By the time the Visigoths arrived at the gates, Rome had already become a shadow of its former self, a hollow giant with diminished legions, a bloated bureaucracy, and a strained economy. When the downfall finally occurred, it resembled less a dramatic catastrophe and more the inevitable collapse of a decayed tree. There is often a temptation to look back at the fall of Rome and draw superficial parallels with our current era, identifying in our social rifts and political troubles the same seeds of decline. Indeed, the Roman narrative offers timeless insights for any society. Lessons emerge concerning the significance of effective governance, social unity, and a collective civic responsibility. However, perhaps the more profound lesson from Rome is the reminder that all things eventually come to an end. The strongest empires and the most dazzling cultures ultimately prove to be as fleeting as the morning dew. Sic transit gloria mundi. Thus passes the glory of the world. Yet, even in its decline, Rome left an enduring imprint on history, one that persists today through our language, our legal systems, our artistic expressions and architectural marvels. The eternal city may have fallen, but its influence continues, a spectre that gently speaks to us across the ages. Therefore, we must acknowledge Rome not merely as a cautionary example, but as a monumental feat of human achievement. For nearly a millennium, this extraordinary civilization fostered law, education, and a degree of unity across a vast expanse of territory. It bequeathed us the Pantheon and the Colosseum, the verses of Virgil, the philosophies of Cicero, the magnificence of Julius Caesar, and the devoutness of Gregory the Great. In every conceivable way, it was an extraordinary triumph. And while its demise was gradual and fraught with sorrow, there is a certain poignancy in how Rome faced its conclusion with a youthful emperor named after the city's founder, alongside barbarian kings reigning in the shadows of emperors, while the Senate continued to convene even as the city fell apart around it. Until the very end, Rome clung to its ancient customs and forms, a final, lingering echo of a bygone world. As we conclude our exploration of Rome's decline and fall, we find ourselves embraced not only by a sense of sadness, but also by a deep appreciation for the grand narrative of history, for the manner in which even the most powerful empires ebb and flow like the tides. Rome's saga serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of human endeavors, yet also underscores their lasting ability to inspire and amaze. So let us bid farewell to Rome, not with grief, but with gratitude for all that it has offered us. And let us forever hold in our hearts the memory of this once magnificent civilization. A brilliant city atop a hill whose light continues to shine upon the world. I appreciate you joining me on this exploration through history. Wishing you sweet dreams. As Constantine's sons fought over their inheritance, the empire's adversaries grew increasingly audacious. In the east, the Sassanid Persians, led by their formidable monarch Shapur II, initiated invasions into Roman Mesopotamia and Armenia. Shapur had begun his reign as king of Persia as a child and ruled for an astonishing 70 years. Throughout his lengthy rule, he engaged in almost continuous warfare against Rome in an effort to recover lost lands. The Romans were confronted with an even more severe threat along their northern borders. For centuries, tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Franks and Saxons had clashed with Roman legions along the Rhine and Danube rivers. The Romans viewed these tribal fighters as uncivilized barbarians. Yet to the Germanic tribes, the affluent Roman provinces presented an alluring prospect for pillage and conquest. As the strain on the frontiers heightened, a startling upheaval spread across Europe and the Near East. Around 370 AD, a fierce nomadic group known as the Huns began their westward migration from their Central Asian homeland. The Huns were skilled horse riders and relentless warriors. Their incursion triggered a chain reaction, prompting tribes like the Goths to flee across the Danube, seeking safety within the Roman Empire. Initially, the Romans attempted to accommodate the newcomers, but tensions quickly escalated. In 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens confronted Gothic forces in battle near the city of Adrianople. This would turn out to be one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Roman history. Valens, underestimating his enemy, recklessly launched an attack before Western reinforcements could arrive. Arrows poured down upon the legions as they advanced across the plain. Valens himself was killed, as the imperial army was surrounded and obliterated. Rome had suffered the loss of an emperor, two-thirds of its eastern forces, and any lingering sense of invincibility. The Battle of Adrianople represented a significant turning point. The military reputation of Rome was irrevocably damaged, and although the Goths could not capture the eastern capital, Constantinople, they were now free to raid the Balkan territories at will. More tribes surged across the borders, attracted by the unmistakable scent of Roman vulnerability. In 406, the Alans, Vandals, and Suevi crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. 3 years later, Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, descended upon Italy and besieged Rome itself. The Eternal City had not confronted a foreign army at its gates for centuries. The tension was palpable as Alaric's Goths encircled the capital. The Senate quickly assembled a ransom made up of gold, silver, silk, and pepper. Alaric withdrew, but an assassination plot against the emperor poisoned any hope for enduring peace. In August of 410, the unimaginable occurred. Alaric's forces invaded Rome and subjected the capital to 3 days of plundering and devastation. Although the sack was relatively restrained by the standards of that era, Alaric, an Arian Christian, prohibited the desecration of churches. The blow to Roman power and prestige was devastating. Saint Jerome, the esteemed Christian scholar, mourned that the light of the world had gone out. The balance of power was inexorably shifting towards the new eastern capital of Constantinople. Yet the shocks continued for the Western Empire. In 429, the Vandals, under their king Gaiseric, moved from Spain into North Africa. With astonishing ease, they captured Carthage, Rome's essential breadbasket. The loss of Africa's crucial grain supplies resulted in a logistical and economic crisis for Italy. The Western Empire had become a mere shadow of its former strength, stripped of resources and territory. A dismal procession of child emperors and military leaders cycled through the palace, powerless to halt the empire's rapid decline. The Vandals once again plundered a defenseless Rome in 455, and in 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by the Germanic leader Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire faded into history, although the Eastern Empire would persist as the Byzantine Empire for nearly another millennium. While some interpret Rome's demise as a sudden disaster, it was more accurately a prolonged disintegration. There wasn't a singular reason for this downfall. Instead, it was a convergence of external assaults and internal decay that gradually depleted Rome's power. Foreign invaders exploited borders that had become weak due to neglect. Armies, loyal to various generals and Germanic leaders, turned against the empire. Severe taxation and rampant inflation, fueled by ongoing conflicts and a devalued currency, devastated the economy. Corruption and excess among the elite ignited public resentment and unrest. The emergence of Christianity fostered vital new social connections while simultaneously creating rifts and diminishing traditional civic engagement. The narrative of Rome's decline is complex, yet the insights draw parallels throughout history. It serves as a warning that greatness and dominance are not everlasting. Repeatedly, from Persia to China to the British Empire, sovereignty has succumbed to decline when nations overreach and become blinded by arrogance and isolation from the warning signs of their own downfall. Historian Edward Gibbon, in his influential work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, portrayed Rome as a magnificent civilization diminished as much by its own actions as by external enemies. Even amid the centuries of bloodshed and upheaval that followed the collapse known as the Dark Ages, the empire's legacy could never be extinguished. The Latin language laid the foundation for several European languages, the Roman alphabet persisted, and the principles of Christianity and ecclesiastical law that developed within the empire spread throughout Europe and beyond. Rome's contributions to literature, architecture, science and philosophy enriched both medieval and modern Western culture. As the Renaissance and Age of Enlightenment emerged, intellectuals revisited the splendor of Rome for inspiration, albeit with a selective focus. The Eternal City may have faced its decline, yet the grandeur and impact of its civilization, though diminished and fragmented, continued to resonate through time. In a way, the Roman Empire never truly vanished. It simply dispersed and transformed, interwoven into the very fabric of the world it once ruled. While the physical empire perished, its philosophies, legal systems, and cultural essence lived on, reimagined and revitalized, influencing new nations and peoples. Rome's narrative illustrates both a decline and a remarkable legacy. Perhaps the closest history has come to an everlasting empire. As we observed, the captured emperor Valerian became a living emblem of Rome's disgrace and diminishing power. His successor, Gallienus, ascended to the throne but faced immense challenges in keeping the empire united. The subsequent decade witnessed a bewildering surge of usurpers and breakaway states, each competing for a share of Roman prestige. During this tumultuous era, an emperor's reign typically lasted only 2 to 3 years, often concluding with assassination or a dishonorable end on the battlefield. Given such turbulence at the highest level, it's no surprise that the empire was fraying at the edges. The GIC Empire separated in the west, claiming control over Britain and portions of Gaul and Spain. Meanwhile, the resplendent Palmyrene Empire under the ambitious Queen Zenobia seized Rome's prosperous eastern provinces. It fell to Emperor Aurelian, who rose from humble beginnings in the legions, to attempt to reunite the fragmented realm. With remarkable skill, determination, and sheer resolve, Aurelian overcame the breakaway powers and confronted invading barbarian tribes to restore a delicate harmony. For his endeavors, the weary emperor was celebrated as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Yet, scarcely had Aurelian secured the borders when he fell victim to assassins in a military plot. Such was the all-too-frequent destiny of military emperors during this chaotic period. The latter part of the 3rd century experienced a rapid turnover of emperors, with numerous leaders meeting grisly fates shortly after assuming power. Though the empire continued for a few more decades, its reputation suffered significantly, and the underlying issues could no longer be overlooked. Urgent reforms were essential to prevent Rome's collapse. This daunting challenge fell to a capable general by the name of Diocletian, whose rule would signify a pivotal moment in the narrative of Rome's gradual downfall. Ascending to power in 284 AD, he was fundamentally a soldier, having climbed the ranks due to his intellect and leadership abilities. Diocletian recognized that the empire could hardly withstand further conflicts fueled by ambitious generals. In response, he made a bold decision to divide the empire into 2 halves. He would govern the eastern section while appointing a co-emperor, Maximian, to oversee the west. Each emperor would then have a junior partner called a Caesar, establishing a 4-person governance structure referred to as the Tetrarchy. The goal was to create clear succession paths and ensure stability. Diocletian's reforms didn't end there. He reorganized provinces into smaller, more manageable divisions and significantly enhanced the imperial administrative system. More governors and tax collectors meant that the emperor's influence reached every corner. However, this also led to increased taxation, which didn't win Diocletian any favors among the common folk. In a desperate bid to counteract inflation, Diocletian proclaimed his well-known edict on maximum prices in 301. This comprehensive law imposed price limits on thousands of goods and services, from the cost of wheat to legal fees. Strict punishments were enforced for merchants who exceeded these caps. Yet, similar to most price control measures, the edict backfired and was largely disregarded. Diocletian identified threats to the empire from both internal and external sources. To him, the growing influence of Christianity directly threatened the emperor's divine authority. In 303, he initiated the most severe and violent persecution of Christians recorded in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were set ablaze, and the faithful were compelled to make sacrifices to the ancient deities under the threat of death. Despite these measures, Diocletian's reforms ultimately fell short in halting the gradual disintegration of Rome. When the aged emperor stepped down in 305 and the tetrarchs began to bicker among themselves, it became evident that a more assertive approach was necessary. The ambitious son of one of the tetrarchs, Constantine, was poised to take charge. The era of Constantine the Great signified a significant turning point in Roman history. Ascending to power after enduring a series of civil conflicts, Constantine would indelibly alter the empire. His most crucial moment unfolded before a battle against his competitor Maxentius in 312. According to the renowned account, Constantine witnessed a vision of a cross in the sky alongside the words, "In this sign conquer." Interpreting this as a sign of divine approval, Constantine marched into battle under the banner of Christ and achieved victory. The subsequent year, he promulgated the Edict of Milan, which established religious tolerance and effectively legalized Christianity throughout the empire. This marked a profound transformation, as a faith that had once faced persecution now received imperial endorsement. Yet perhaps Constantine's most tangible legacy was the establishment of a magnificent new capital named after him, Constantinople. Located on the Bosphorus Strait, this new Rome was inaugurated in 330 AD. With its strategically advantageous position and strongly fortified walls, Constantinople would become the vibrant center of the empire long after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. When Constantine passed away in 337, the empire was divided among his feuding sons, and it would never be fully reunited again. As imperial authority diminished, the stage was set for Rome's final chapter. All the while, the escalating influence of Christianity permeated through society, slowly displacing the pagan customs that had underpinned Rome for centuries. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire had dwindled to a mere shadow of its former glory. The once grand Pax Romana had surrendered to an era of uncertainty. As the increasingly fractured empire confronted threats from multiple directions, barbarian tribes that had previously been kept at bay began to gather ominously like storm clouds on the horizon. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and various Germanic tribes had engaged in trade and warfare with Rome for ages. Often, they were permitted to settle within Roman borders in return for military assistance. However, as the imperial authority waned, these agreements became strained. Disturbing signs of unrest echoed from the forests beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. This fragile equilibrium was disrupted by the sudden emergence of the Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. However, as the imperial authority waned, these agreements became strained. Disturbing signs of unrest echoed from the forests beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. This fragile equilibrium was disrupted by the sudden emergence of the Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. United under their ambitious leader, King Attila, the Huns carved a violent path through Europe, prompting Gothic refugees to flee into Roman territories. The Visigoths were granted entry into the empire in 376, yet they soon rebelled against their hosts. This Gothic uprising peaked in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378. The Eastern Empire's emperor, Valens, recklessly attempted to crush the Goths without waiting for reinforcements, only to find himself outmaneuvered and encircled on the battlefield. Valens perished, along with 2/3 of his forces. It was the most crushing defeat that Rome had encountered, since Hannibal triumphed at Cannae over 6 centuries prior. The devastating bloodshed at Adrianople foreshadowed what was to come. A few decades later, the Goths would arrive at the very gates of Rome. Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, had once fought alongside the Romans. Yet, when the promises of land and tribute were not fulfilled, Alaric turned against his former masters. Alaric's troops pillaged Rome in 410 AD, marking the first instance in nearly 800 years that the city had succumbed to an outside aggressor. The Eternal City was so intertwined with the Roman state that many viewed this disaster as a harbinger of the empire's impending collapse. As the esteemed Christian philosopher, St. Jerome lamented, "If Rome can fall, what can be secure?" While Rome's reputation was profoundly damaged, the material devastation was even more severe. The sack of 410 was succeeded by an even greater calamity when the Vandals seized control of North Africa, Rome's vital grain supply, in 429. The city that once nourished an empire was now struggling to feed itself, reliant on a meager flow of grain from Egypt. With its territories decimated, the Western Empire witnessed its revenue dwindle. There simply wasn't enough gold in the imperial treasury to support the legions or the grand construction projects of yesteryear. Additionally, Rome could no longer depend on its traditional model of military recruitment, as the robust farmer soldiers of Italy had disappeared long ago, their lands consumed by vast estates. Instead, the beleaguered empire became increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries, enlisting Goths, Huns, and others to engage in battle. These unpredictable barbarian fighters were often a double-edged sword, just as likely to rebel against their Roman leaders as they were to defend them. By the late 5th century, this precarious arrangement would herald the demise of an empire. The Western Roman Empire's final anticlimactic chapter unfolded in 476 AD. The last emperor, the unfortunately named Romulus Augustulus, ascended the throne as a mere teenager. Though he boasted the illustrious lineage of Julius, this Romulus echoed only faintly the power of Rome's mythical founder. The true power resided with Romulus's father, Orestes, a general and diplomat of Germanic heritage. When Orestes refused to grant the barbarian mercenaries' demands for land, their leader, Odoacer, rebelled. Orestes was quickly captured and executed, leaving his unfortunate son to abdicate. The discarded emperor then retreated to a monastery. For his part, Odoacer found no reason to maintain the illusion of the Western Empire any longer. He returned the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople and simply declared himself King of Italy. After struggling for decades, the once mighty Roman state had finally met its end with a feeble whimper. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire would persist as the Byzantine Empire for nearly another 1,000 years, till the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Byzantines never stopped considering themselves Romans, the unbroken heirs to the legacy of Augustus and Trajan. Nevertheless, the decline of the Western Empire signified the closure of an era. The collapse of Rome was not due to any single individual or cause, rather it was a death by countless wounds, a perfect storm of external perils and internal decline. At its core was a gradual yet significant change in the social structure of Rome itself, as the republic of smallholders and aristocrats yielded to an unwieldy structure of imperial grandeur, alongside a permanent underclass reliant on aid. Prolonged wars of conquest had expanded the Roman Empire, but managing those vast holdings and borders proved too great a challenge. While expansion initially brought in slaves, plunder, and tribute that filled Roman coffers, it also sowed the seeds of the empire's downfall. As the empire expanded, so did the expenses needed to guard its distant frontiers. A bloated military increasingly dictated political affairs, leading to a surge in coups and civil unrest. Authority shifted from the Senate to military barracks, ultimately becoming a deadly reward for any general with enough ambition and a loyal following. Ensuring internal stability came at the expense of outward vitality as a once vibrant society calcified into a fragile, autocratic rule. In the insightful words of historian Tacitus, as the empire grew, they created a wasteland and called it peace. That desolate expanse became a thriving ground for the ascent of Christianity, a faith that provided spiritual solace and the promise of eternal life to those living in a realm filled with uncertainty. Eventually, the vigor of Rome depleted as it succumbed to pressure from the barbarian tribes it had long managed to suppress. A surge of migrations prompted by the relentless advance of the Huns crashed against the empire's borders until they could no longer withstand the strain. Ultimately, the collapse did not occur with a loud boom, but through a gradual, suffocating descent into the shadows of history. Rome's decline carries a sobering takeaway. No empire, regardless of its might, can escape the passage of time. Even a domain as expansive and powerful as Rome can be unraveled by a mixture of forces, some striking, others barely perceived as they unfolded. Yet the legacy of Rome persisted long after the end of the Caesars. Its language, laws, and traditions became the foundational culture of both medieval and modern Europe. The Western imagination. The very notion of Rome, the vision of an eternal city illuminating the standards of civilization, continued to exert a significant influence on the Western imagination. In the ensuing centuries, popes and emperors would adopt the aura of Rome's lost grandeur. What was the Holy Roman Empire if not a tribute to its namesake? It aimed to revive the splendor of the Caesars in a new form. The Renaissance sought to reclaim the magnificence of the classical era, drawing from the insights of the ancients as it sought to forge a new age. Perhaps the true benchmark of a civilization lies not in its longevity, but in what it imparts to future generations. In this light, Rome's magnificence was never completely extinguished. It continued to exist in the soaring arches of medieval cathedrals, in the elegant columns of Enlightenment structures, and in the very essence of our political and cultural institutions. The demise of Rome was lengthy, chaotic, and anticlimactic, diminished by centuries of conflict and misfortune. Yet, its reverberations still resonate through history, an immortal empire existing in the realm of the mind. For as long as we have known the timeless city, Rome will never completely vanish. Diocletian's reforms did manage to restore a degree of stability and security to the empire, at least temporarily. However, these improvements came with significant drawbacks. His stringent economic controls, including wage and price regulations, hampered trade and stifled creativity. The bureaucracy became swollen and corrupt, and the increased burden placed on ordinary Romans to finance Diocletian's enlarged military only fostered greater resentment. Even Diocletian appeared to acknowledge the limitations of what any single individual, regardless of their power, could accomplish to reverse the empire's downward spiral. In a nearly unparalleled decision for a Roman emperor, Diocletian chose to retire in 305 AD, stepping down from the imperial seat and returning to his estate on the Dalmatian coast to cultivate cabbages. Yet without the unyielding strength of Diocletian maintaining order, the tetrarchy quickly fell apart. His co-emperor Maximian refused to step down and attempted to reclaim authority. The two junior emperors, Galerius and Constantius, began vying for supremacy. Moreover, waiting in the wings was Constantius's ambitious son Constantine, who was destined to reunite the empire under his own leadership. Young Constantine had spent years almost as a captive at Diocletian's court, observing and absorbing lessons from the veteran emperor. Following his father Constantius's death in Britain in 306, Constantine was declared emperor by his soldiers. Nevertheless, he still faced challenges from the other tetrarchs, namely Maximian's son Maxentius, who governed Italy, and Galerius's successor Licinius, who held power in the east. What ensued was a series of intense power struggles and civil conflicts as the empire once more turned against itself. In 312 AD, Constantine advanced on Rome to confront Maxentius. On the eve of the pivotal battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly experienced a divine vision, witnessing a cross in the sky and hearing the phrase, "In this sign you shall conquer." By placing the Christian symbol on the shields of his soldiers, Constantine achieved victory over Maxentius, who perished in the Tiber River as his forces were defeated. With a resounding entry into Rome, one of Constantine's first actions was to legitimize Christianity through the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. This was a pivotal moment, transforming the once persecuted religion into one that received the favor of the empire. Constantine then shifted his focus toward Licinius in the east. After several early encounters, the two co-emperors united to issue the Edict of Milan and manage their respective portions of the empire. Yet, the truce between the two rulers was not meant to last. In 324, Constantine overcame Licinius in battle, leading to the execution of both him and his son the following year. Now the sole ruler of the entire Roman realm, Constantine marked his triumph by establishing a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium in 330 AD. Strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, the city was richly adorned with forums, palaces, hippodromes, and churches, rivaling the glory of old Rome. Soon it blossomed into a vibrant hub for the Eastern Empire. Simultaneously, traditional pagan customs waned as Constantine poured resources into the church. He constructed magnificent basilicas, including the Old St. Peter's in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He also got involved in church councils to help shape Christian doctrine. Although he waited to be baptized until he was on his deathbed, he set the empire on a trajectory toward becoming a fully Christian state. However, as he aimed to strengthen the empire, underlying issues started to surface. In 326, Constantine executed his eldest son Crispus and his wife Fausta for reasons that remain unclear, while his three surviving sons were eager to seize power following his death. When Constantine passed away in 337, he was interred in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, but left the empire once again split among his contentious heirs. The Constantinian dynasty would remain in power over the Roman Empire for several additional decades, yet it increasingly became a fractured entity. Constantine's offspring, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, clashed with one another in a series of ruinous civil wars. By 350 AD, Constantius II emerged as the sole sovereign following the deaths of his brothers in combat. However, Constantius II soon encountered another internal challenge from his own lineage. In 355, he designated his cousin Julian as Caesar, or deputy emperor, and dispatched him to Gaul to protect the Rhine frontier. Julian achieved a series of unexpected victories against Germanic invaders, earning the admiration of his troops. In 360, they proclaimed him Augustus, or ruling emperor, much to Constantius's discontent. Yet Constantius died before a confrontation could occur between them, allowing Julian to become the sole emperor. Nevertheless, his reign would be brief, yet impactful. Initially raised a Christian, Julian renounced the faith and sought to rejuvenate paganism, which earned him the title Julian the Apostate. He expelled Christians from government roles and launched an ambitious military endeavor against Rome's ancient adversary, Persia. Tragically, Julian suffered a fatal injury in battle in 363 and passed away without an heir, plunging the empire back into disorder. Over the following decades, emperors rapidly rose and fell amid fierce struggles for dominance among rival generals. The frontiers weakened significantly as barbarian pressures increased. Concurrently, the significant cultural and religious changes initiated by Constantine continued to evolve. Christianity steadily gained traction, encroaching on the remnants of the old gods. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples and rituals were no longer merely discouraged but outright banned. Traditional classical education and literature became increasingly interpreted through a Christian perspective. Meanwhile, the Germanic tribes that had long been restrained persistently battered the empire's gates. Rome had spent centuries attempting to subdue and integrate these barbarian groups, bringing them within its imperial borders as federates in return for peace and military aid. Nevertheless, this arrangement was fraught with tension. Romans regarded the Germans as uncivilized brutes, while Germans resented the wealth and authority of Rome. As the 4th century neared its end, the pressure escalated. In the bitter winter of 406 AD, the Rhine River froze over and hordes of barbarians surged across the icy expanse into the empire's core. Gaul became inundated by the Alans, Swabians, and Vandals. The Romano-British found themselves defenseless as the imperial government redirected troops to confront the growing crisis. Italy itself experienced devastation at the hands of the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric in 410 AD, marking the first time in 800 years that outsiders had breached the walls of Rome. The invasions and sackings reverberated throughout the empire, instilling a profound sense of dread among many Romans. The eminent Christian theologian, Saint Jerome, who observed the Visigoths' ravages up close, lamented, "The bright light of all the world was extinguished. The Roman Empire was decapitated, and to put it more accurately, the entire world came to an end in one city." The once mighty Roman legions, which had long safeguarded the borders, had become mere shadows of their former glory, weakened by years of internal strife and a failing economy. Barbarian mercenaries constituted a significant portion of the military now, and as Rome struggled to recruit enough native soldiers, these mercenaries often pledged greater loyalty to their tribal chiefs than to the emperor. This was epitomized in the figure of Flavius Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who wielded considerable influence behind the throne in the Western Empire during the early 400s AD. Honorius ordered the execution of Stilicho in 408 AD, a choice that left the Western Empire without a formidable guardian. As the 400s progressed, the Western Empire continued to descend into chaos and disintegration. Effective governance diminished to just Italy and segments of Gaul and Spain. Emperors in Ravenna had become mere figureheads as barbarian warlords vied for supremacy. In the 430s, the Vandals captured North Africa, severing Rome's access to crucial grain supplies necessary for sustaining its populace. The loss of tax income from Africa represented another significant blow to the Western Empire. The succession of Western emperors staggered on for several more decades, eventually leading to a definitive yet ignoble conclusion. In 475 AD, a general named Orestes orchestrated a palace coup, placing his adolescent son Romulus in a puppet role as emperor. The youthful ruler was derisively dubbed Romulus Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. However, Orestes made a pivotal error. His forces were primarily composed of Germanic mercenaries, including the Heruli, Skierings, and Ruians, who demanded land in Italy as recompense for their loyalty. When he denied their request, they rebelled, led by a Germanic commander named Odoacer. Odoacer's troops swiftly overtook the imperial capital of Ravenna. Orestes was executed, and young Romulus Augustulus had no choice but to renounce his throne. According to some accounts, Odoacer showed mercy towards the boy, sparing his life, granting him a pension, and sending him to live with relatives in southern Italy. With no need for an emperor, Odoacer returned the imperial regalia to Constantinople and declared himself King of Italy. Effectively, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. The date was September 4th, 476 AD, a moment often recognized as the fall of the Roman Empire, yet in reality there was no singular dramatic event that brought about its end. The empire had been deteriorating gradually for decades, if not centuries. The sacking of Rome in 410, the loss of Africa in the 430s, and the fading of a strong central authority were all part of a prolonged trajectory of decline and fragmentation. Although 476 AD signified the end of an emperor in the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire, which is now referred to as the Byzantine Empire, would persist for nearly another millennium, ultimately collapsing with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Even after this, the Byzantines continued to refer to themselves as Romans. The narrative surrounding Rome's demise is intricate and devoid of straightforward explanations. Throughout this series, we've examined various critical aspects that contributed to its downfall, from political disorder and economic struggles to military threats and evolving cultural dynamics. Yet one of the most significant insights is that empires, regardless of how formidable they may appear, are fundamentally fragile. The philosopher Edward Gibbon articulated this clearly in his renowned work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, stating, "The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight." Essentially, the very attributes that enhanced Rome's greatness, its vast expanse, immense wealth, and rich diversity, also rendered it susceptible to downfall. The empire grew excessively large to manage effectively, and its economy became too uneven to sustain. While the integration of numerous peoples and cultures into the Roman system was commendable in its cosmopolitanism, it also complicated the maintenance of a shared identity and common goals. Ultimately, Rome fell victim to its own success. The burden of empire proved overwhelmingly heavy, but its influence would persist long after the last emperor vacated his throne. The Byzantines would uphold Roman traditions in the East for many centuries thereafter. The Byzantines would uphold Roman traditions in the East for many centuries thereafter. The barbarian realms of the West, while dismantling Roman institutions, also absorbed much of Roman culture, law, and religion. The concept of Rome, of a universal empire uniting diverse peoples under one banner, would continue to motivate aspiring conquerors from Charlemagne to Napoleon. The founders of the United States intentionally designed their new republic with Rome in mind, even down to the architectural style of their Capitol building. Thus, while the Roman Empire may have collapsed, its essence persisted, continuing to influence us even now. Its successes and downfalls provide valuable insights into the nature of power, the progression of history, and the ascendance and decline of great civilizations. The narrative of Rome often mirrors the broader narrative of human civilization itself, encapsulating both its magnificence and its shortcomings. It's a tale rich in complexity, one that can never be fully explored or exhausted. Nonetheless, I hope this series has provided at least a hint of the vastness and enduring intrigue of Roman history. The empire that once extended from the moors of Scotland to the Sahara's sands, from the Atlantic shores to the Euphrates banks, may be lost to time. The Forum, where Cicero and Caesar once stood, is now merely ruins. The Colosseum, once a site of gladiatorial combat, is now a popular tourist destination. The Pantheon, which once served as a temple to Rome's gods, now rests the tombs of Italian monarchs. Yet, the remnants of Rome endure and will continue to do so as long as there are those who study its history and reflect on the lessons learned from its rise and decline. The Eternal City may no longer hold dominion over the world, but it will forever occupy a significant place in our collective imagination. Because the tale of Rome ultimately acts as a reflection of the human condition itself, revealing our highest aspirations along with our deepest fears, our greatest victories alongside our most profound heartbreaks. And this is why, even after centuries have passed, it continues to inspire us, captivate our imaginations, and elicit contemplation of its enigmas as we traverse through dreams or experience the remnants of its magnificent ruins in our waking lives. Following the resolution of the 3rd century crisis and Diocletian's reforms that reinstated a degree of stability to the empire, a new leader emerged destined to transform Roman history indelibly. This sentence continues the narrative about the transformation of the empire. This individual was Constantine, whose reign represented a crucial inflection point for Rome in multiple respects. Born in Nisus, in what is now Serbia, Constantine was the offspring of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's fellow emperors. Displaying ambition and military talent from an early age, Constantine excelled in his pursuit of power. He fought alongside his father in campaigns against the Picts in Britain, quickly ascending the ranks within the military. However, it was in 312 AD that Constantine's own path and the destiny of Rome would change irreversibly. On the eve of the Milvian Bridge battle near Rome, he gazed at the sky and perceived a luminous cross above the sun, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Interpreting this as a divine message from the Christian God, Constantine commanded his soldiers to emblazon the cross on their shields before the battle commenced. Interpreting this as a divine message from the Christian God, Constantine commanded his soldiers to emblazon the cross on their shields before the battle commenced. Against all odds, his forces triumphed, leading him to make a triumphant entrance into Rome as the uncontested ruler of the West. Yet, the victory at the Milvian Bridge was merely the onset of Constantine's remarkable narrative. In the subsequent years, he would solidify his power and implement extensive reforms that would have a lasting impact on the Roman sphere. Perhaps his most crucial action occurred in 313 when he promulgated the Edict of Milan. This revolutionary edict introduced religious freedom across the empire and effectively legitimized Christianity, which had been previously banned and persecuted under Roman authority. The Edict of Milan brought an end to centuries of suffering for early Christians and set the stage for the religion's swift expansion in subsequent years. Constantine himself eventually embraced Christianity, making him the inaugural Roman emperor to adopt the faith. He took an active interest in church matters, even convening the renowned Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve theological disagreements among bishops. With Constantine's support, grand churches began to emerge throughout the empire, including the famous Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Yet Constantine's impact reached far beyond just religious matters. He also implemented significant administrative reforms, reorganizing the provinces of the empire and establishing a more efficient governance system. He introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, which would become the primary currency of the Roman world for centuries to come. Perhaps most notably, in the year 330, Constantine founded a new capital for the empire in the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Renamed Constantinople in his honor, this new center of power would stand as the heart of Roman authority in the East for over a millennium, long after the Western Empire's decline. Unfortunately, Constantine's vision of a unified Christian empire did not survive long after his passing in 337. In a harbinger of future conflicts, his sons fought fiercely over their inheritance, ultimately dividing the empire among themselves. Thus, the Roman world would never again be truly unified. Nevertheless, Constantine's legacy continued to resonate throughout the ages. The Christianization of the empire that he initiated would steadily progress, gradually replacing ancient pagan customs. The city he established, Constantinople, would remain a stronghold of civilization even as Rome itself fell into ruin. The city he established, Constantinople, would remain a stronghold of civilization even as Rome itself fell into ruin. And the reforms he initiated in administration and military strategy would leave an indelible mark on the future of Roman history for generations to come. In numerous ways, the era of Constantine signified the final breath of a cohesive Roman Empire. As the 4th century came to a close, the initial fractures that had emerged during the crisis of the 3rd century began to open up into vast rifts. Barbarian invasions, economic hardship, and religious conflicts would soon rip the Roman world apart. Yet, for a few fleeting decades, Constantine had succeeded in mending the fraying empire, weaving it together with the unifying fabric of Christianity. His governance signified a rare glimpse of clarity amidst the encroaching darkness. A final spark of illumination before the prolonged night of Rome's decline set in. As we will explore, that decline was still far off. The western part of the empire would manage to persist for another century, tenaciously clinging to its diminishing glory. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire established by Constantine would survive for many additional centuries as the final stronghold of Roman civilization. Nevertheless, the forces destined to bring Rome to its knees were already amassing beyond its borders. In the forests of Germany and the steppes of Central Asia, the barbarian tribes were stirring, their desire for conquest awakening. In the forests of Germany and the steppes of Central Asia, the barbarian tribes were stirring, their desire for conquest awakening. The Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks, names that would soon invoke dread in the hearts of Romans, were gathering on the outskirts of the empire. For the moment, the legions held them at bay, repelling their advances and securing the borders. Constantine's fortifications still surrounded Constantinople, and the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, continued to prevail across much of Europe and the Mediterranean. Yet the era of the emperors was nearing its end. The magnificent reigns of Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius were fading into the past. The empire was entering its twilight, and the barbarians were at the gates. As we navigate the complex landscape of Rome's decline, we'll encounter the individuals who battled fruitlessly against the inevitable, the final champions of a waning empire. We will witness, one by one, as the lights of Roman culture begin to extinguish, leaving only embers amid the encroaching darkness. However, our attention must first pivot to the frontiers, to the untamed territories where Rome's fate would eventually be determined. It was in the rugged woodlands of Germany and the breezy expanses of the Danube that the initial seeds of the empire's downfall were sown. For ages, the barbarian tribes had consistently plagued Rome, serving as a persistent source of disruption and turmoil along its borders. Generations of Roman commanders had sought to conquer these tribes, attempting to bring them under the authority of the empire, and at times they were successful. The Pax Romana had expanded its influence far beyond the heart of Italy, fostering order and wealth in regions that had once been chaotic and unrestrained. Yet, as the empire began to buckle under the weight of its own enormity and intricacies, those long-held certainties began to erode. The legions, once perceived as unbeatable, now found it difficult to maintain their defense against the rising tide of barbarian invasions. The first significant setback struck in 378 at the Battle of Adrianople, present-day Turkey, where a vast army of Goths, commanded by a chieftain named Fritigern, decimated a Roman force, resulting in the death of Eastern Emperor Valens. This shocking defeat shattered the long-established perception of invulnerability that surrounded Roman legions. From that moment, the floodgates were wide open. In 406, a multitude of Vandals, Alans and Suebi surged across the frozen Rhine into Gaul, igniting flames throughout the Western Empire. The Romans would never regain dominance over those lost regions. Meanwhile, the Huns advanced relentlessly, pushing wave after wave of Germanic tribes before them as they journeyed westward from the steppes of Central Asia. The most notable of the Hunnic leaders was Attila, often referred to as the Scourge of God. His forces ravaged the Balkans and Gaul during the 440s and 450s. Even Rome was not shielded from the intensifying disorder. In 410, the unimaginable occurred. After 800 years of seeming invulnerability, the city faced a sacking by an external foe. An army of Visigoths led by the warlord Alaric breached the city's defences and looted the Eternal City for 3 days, leaving the Roman world in shock. Yet perhaps the most devastating setback came a couple of decades later. In 455, the Vandals, one of the barbarian factions that had crossed the Rhine 50 years prior, invaded Italy from their newly acquired territories in North Africa. Their king, Gaiseric, commanded his troops on a scorched earth strategy throughout the peninsula, culminating in a ferocious 2-week plunder of Rome. The Vandals stripped the city of its wealth, taking precious artifacts and thousands of captives. They even removed the gold from the roof of Jupiter's temple, a powerful emblem of Rome's diminishing grandeur. However, the tangible destruction was minor compared to the psychological effect it had. The Vandal sack signified the onset of the end for the Western Empire. The emperors that followed resembled mere puppets controlled by barbarian chieftains, wielding the true power behind the throne. The legions had become shadows of their glorious past, incapable of guarding the empire's disintegrating borders. The ancient order was collapsing everywhere. Western cities were emptying as commerce disintegrated, and the middle class disappeared. The magnificent estates of the senatorial elite lay in decay, their mosaics broken and gardens untended. In the rural areas, the traditional Roman system of latifundia, large agricultural estates reliant on slave labor, was failing, giving way to a new feudal structure focused on local strongmen and their bands of followers. Amidst this turmoil, the last emperors of the West clung to their thrones like desperate individuals reaching for anything buoyant in turbulent waters. Yet their periods of rule were often brief and fraught with difficulties, tainted by coups, assassinations, and invasions from barbarian forces. The conclusion was almost anticlimactic. In 476 AD, a chieftain named Odoacer overthrew the youthful emperor Romulus Augustulus, dispatching the imperial insignia back to Constantinople, accompanied by a message for the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The role of Western Emperor had lost its significance. Henceforth, Italy would be led by kings. Thus, with a soft sigh rather than a grand finale, the Western Roman Empire met its demise. The magnificent civilization that had for centuries dominated the Mediterranean world had ultimately succumbed to internal decay and external pressures. Meanwhile, the empire established by Constantine persisted in the east. For another millennium, Byzantine emperors governed from Constantinople, overseeing a vibrant culture that melded Greco-Roman legacies with Orthodox Christianity and Eastern influences. As the Western Empire disintegrated, the Byzantines continued constructing stunning churches and palaces, supporting artistic and literary endeavors that would influence European culture for ages. The formidable walls of Constantinople resisted countless waves of would-be conquerors, from the Arabs to the Avars to the Russians. It was not until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks finally breached those ancient defenses, that the last remnants of the Roman Empire were extinguished. By that time, however, the world had already moved forward. The Roman era had faded into history, and a new age was emerging, an era of knights and castles, of crusades and cathedrals, of the rise of Islam and new journeys of exploration. Nevertheless, amidst all that followed, the legacy of Rome persisted. For centuries, European monarchs would consider themselves successors to the Caesars. Even as the remnants of the Forum and the Colosseum stood as silent witnesses to history, they transformed into destinations for countless artists and thinkers, fueling a creative legacy that remains influential to this day. Ultimately, the essence of Rome's magnificence may not be measured solely by the empire's durability or the vastness of its conquests, but rather by the lasting impact of its heritage. While the physical remnants of Roman civilization may have faded into oblivion, the concepts and principles that Rome gifted to the world, such as law, citizenship, art, and literature, along with the intrinsic dignity of the individual, continued to influence the trajectory of history long after the last emperor had fallen. The narrative of Rome's decline is intricate and layered, a saga spanning centuries marked by warfare and peace, glory and degradation, order and disorder. It encompasses mighty leaders and everyday soldiers, barbarian chieftains and cunning bureaucrats, as well as seers and ordinary citizens swept into the currents of history. Yet foremost, it is a testament to the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit, of the unwavering determination of men and women to resist the relentless tides of fate, even as their world disintegrated around them. Thus, the collapse of Rome transcended mere political or military significance. It constituted a human tragedy, a slow-moving disaster that unfolded across generations, altering the course of history in ways that would echo through centuries. As we conclude our exploration of the complex journey of Roman decline, let us take a moment to ponder the insights that this grand civilization's fall might offer for our own era. While we admire the splendor and majesty of ancient Rome, we must also confront the harsh truths of its descent, including the insidious consequences of corruption and decadence, the risks of overreach and imperial arrogance, as well as the threats posed by religious conflict and social upheaval. In a time marked by swift transformations and worldwide turmoil, there are invaluable lessons for us to consider. As poet Shelley eloquently expressed in words that seem to encapsulate the spirit of Rome's lasting influence, the solitary and flat sands stretch endlessly, vacant and unadorned, and upon the pedestal these significant phrases are inscribed: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Observe my achievements, ye powerful, and despair. Nothing else remains." The tale of Rome ultimately reflects the narrative of all prominent civilizations. It is a saga of ascent and decline, of victory and sorrow, embodying the timeless cycle of creation and destruction at the core of the human journey. This narrative continues to echo through time, prompting us to contemplate the vulnerability of even the most formidable empires and the enduring resolve of the human spirit to rise anew from the ruins of defeat. As we prepare to drift into slumber, let's envision Rome with its splendor and magnificence, its excesses and decline. Let's dream of the remarkable individuals who forged its fate, alongside the everyday citizens who lived, loved, and battled under its shadow. And let's cling to the insights that this grand civilization's tale may offer for our own era. Lessons of bravery and empathy, of perseverance and revival, and the unwavering hope that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit will prevail. Good night and sweet dreams. The Praetorian Guard, originally established as an elite division to safeguard the emperor, had by this era morphed into a formidable political entity itself. They recognized that being the bearers of swords and spears, they possessed the power to determine who would ascend the imperial throne. This set off a brutal cycle in the 3rd century where an emperor would seize power only to be ousted or murdered by the Praetorians whenever they became dissatisfied or were persuaded by a rival offering more appealing terms. A notorious instance of this was Emperor Pertinax. He ascended to power in 193 AD, backed by the Praetorian Guard, who had eliminated his predecessor, Commodus. Nevertheless, Pertinax soon fell out of favor when he attempted to enforce stricter military order and implement austere economic policies. After just 87 days in office, he was besieged by a group of disgruntled Praetorians. When he sought to negotiate with them, he was swiftly stabbed to death. The events that followed are almost beyond comprehension. The Praetorians, fresh from committing regicide, opted to sell the imperial throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus emerged victorious, promising a staggering 25,000 sesterces to each Praetorian Guard, equivalent to several years of pay. Julianus had a short-lived reign, as he was ousted and executed by a rival general merely 2 months later. It appeared the Praetorian Guard's loyalties lay solely with wealth and personal gain. While the Praetorians wreaked havoc in Rome, a different threat loomed at the empire's borders. For centuries, adept diplomacy, strategic alliances, and intermittent displays of military strength had kept the Germanic tribes at bay. However, as the internal disorder of the 3rd century crisis weakened Rome's authority, the barbarians grew increasingly restless and bold in their incursions into imperial lands. The empire had long possessed a strained rapport with the Gothic people residing north of the Danube River. They were first recorded in a now-lost work by the 3rd century historian Cassius Dio, who chronicled a battle in 238 AD wherein the Goths decimated a Roman force and took numerous captives. The most devastating blow occurred in 251 AD when the Goths defeated and killed Roman Emperor Decius during the Battle of Abritus. Decius had been campaigning against the Goths, seeking to repel them from the Danube boundary, but fell victim to a trap laid by the Gothic king, Gothi, near the town of Abritus in present-day Bulgaria. The Roman legions found themselves encircled and slaughtered in the muddy landscapes. Decius and his offspring were among the deceased, marking them as the first Roman emperors to be slain in combat against an external foe. This delivered a psychological trauma from which the empire would struggle to recover completely. The once indomitable reputation of Rome had been fractured. The disgrace experienced at Britus remained an open sore when merely 9 years later an unimaginable event transpired. The Emperor Valerian, who took over from Decius, was engaged in a campaign against the Persian Empire to the east. In 260 AD, Valerian arranged a meeting with the Persian monarch Shapur-Bern to broker peace. Unfortunately, the gathering turned out to be a trap. Valerian was seized and would live out the rest of his days as a captive of the Persians, a considerable humiliation for Rome. In an ancient twist of psychological warfare, Shapur was rumored to have employed Valerian as a human footrest while mounting his steed. Following Valerian's death, it was claimed that his skin was removed stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy in a Persian temple. The implication was unmistakable. The Romans, renowned for their military prowess and perceived invincibility, could indeed be undermined by a clever adversary. Back in Rome, Valerian's son Gallienus ascended to the imperial seat, yet his right to rule faced immediate jeopardy. With the empire in a precarious position, local commanders began to declare themselves independent monarchs. In the east, a province known as Palmyra, led by a captivating queen named Zenobia, announced its independence and captured Egypt along with vast portions of Asia Minor. In the west, a general named Postumus formed a separatist regime in Gaul, Britain, and segments of Spain termed the Gyc Empire. For over a decade, Gallienus fought to maintain the unity of the empire against these secessionist movements, all while repelling further incursions by the Goths and Alemanni along the Danube and Rhine borders. The implication was unmistakable. By the time of his assassination by his own soldiers in 268, the Roman Empire faced a genuine threat of complete collapse. Into this tumultuous situation stepped Gallienus's successor, Claudius II, who would earn the name Claudius Gothicus, or Claudius, the victor over the Goths. A distinguished general and skilled leader, Claudius achieved a string of significant victories against the Goths, most notably the monumental Battle of Nessus in either 268 or 269. Although contemporary historians debate the scale of the battle, with ancient sources reporting inflated casualty figures, it undeniably served as a crucial morale booster for the beleaguered Romans. Yet Claudius Gothicus didn't have the chance to fully relish his victories for long. He became ill and succumbed to plague in 270, but another formidable general, Aurelian, succeeded him and would ultimately bring a degree of order back to the empire. Aurelian first confronted the rebellious regions, reclaiming Palmyra along with its illustrious queen in 272. Zenobia was captured and taken to Rome, where she was displayed in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph, an extravagant victory celebration. With Palmyra tamed, Aurelian shifted his focus to the Gyc Empire. Through a series of confrontations, he defeated Posuus's successor Trius and reunified the western provinces with the rest of the empire. For the first time in over 15 years, the Roman Empire was once more governed by a single emperor. Despite Aurelian soon falling victim to assassination, the fate faced by many soldier emperors during this turbulent period, he had managed to salvage the empire from the threat of destruction and paved the way for a much-needed era of reform and rejuvenation under Emperor Diocletian. The Aurelian walls of Rome stand as a testament to this delicate time. Aurelian understood that both invasions and civil conflicts were bringing the risk of an attack ever closer to the imperial capital. Although Rome had long prided itself on not requiring fortifications, that era of confidence had come to an end. The 12-mile circuit of walls, adorned with imposing gates and defensive towers, highlighted that even the venerable city was no longer untouchable. As we've observed, the crisis-ridden years of the 3rd century witnessed Rome crumble under the weight of fragile, inconsistent leadership, barbarian invasions, and secessionist regions that undermined the very notion of a unified empire ruled by a single sovereign. Although Aurelian had staunched the bleeding, the rot at the core persisted. It was up to his successor Diocletian to take decisive action, fundamentally restructuring the empire in a desperate bid to rescue Rome from impending ruin. When Diocletian ascended to the throne in 284 AD, he encountered an empire that was a stark contrast to the confident, conquering giant of former centuries. The borders remained vulnerable. The treasury was near empty. The imperial throne had devolved into a perilous game of musical chairs, with the strongest armies seizing power only to be usurped by the next contender. Having climbed the ranks of the military himself, Diocletian recognized that superficial adjustments would no longer be effective. A comprehensive overhaul of the imperial system was imperative to avert a collapse. Central to Diocletian's reforms was the tetrarchy, or rule of 4. He acknowledged that the empire had expanded to such an extent that it could not be effectively managed by a single emperor. His solution was to distribute authority among 4 co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each tasked with overseeing a quarter of the empire. When an Augustus passed away or stepped down, his Caesar would ascend to his role and a new Caesar would be named. This system was designed to establish a more structured line of succession and end the cycle of civil strife. To enhance operational efficiency, Diocletian significantly broadened the bureaucracy, establishing a detailed hierarchy of provincial governors, viceroys and praetorian prefects to handle the empire's daily operations. The number of provinces nearly increased from 48 to 85, aimed at simplifying governance. Diocletian also attempted to tackle the empire's financial troubles with his price control edict in 301 AD, striving to combat rampant inflation by establishing price limits on commodities and services. While the intention behind the edict was commendable, it ultimately fell short and proved difficult to enforce. More consequentially, Diocletian perceived the growth of Christianity as a significant threat to the stability of the empire. In 303 AD, he enacted a series of directives mandating the destruction of churches, the incineration of sacred texts, and the imprisonment of clergy. Christians were prohibited from holding public office and could be forced to make sacrifices to Roman deities or face death. This marked the most intense persecution that Christians had encountered in the empire to date. Many faced martyrdom in the arenas, including St. George, who has since been revered as the patron saint of England. Despite the relentless persecution, Christianity continued its spread, rendering Diocletian's attempts to extinguish it ultimately ineffectual. In 305 AD, at 60 years old, Diocletian unexpectedly chose to retire, becoming the first Roman emperor to abdicate voluntarily. He withdrew to his opulent seaside palace on the Dalmatian coast, where it is said he spent his time tending to his garden. When asked to resume power a few years later, he reportedly replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he certainly wouldn't dare suggest that I trade the tranquility and joy of this place for the turmoil of insatiable greed." Yet, Diocletian's vision of a tranquil retirement was not to be realized. Lacking his strong leadership, the tetrarchy he established began to fall apart. The Augustinian Caesars competed for dominance, each striving to become the singular ruler of the empire. This led to yet another wave of civil wars as rival claimants vied for control. Ultimately, it was an ambitious young general named Constantine who would prevail and steer the empire toward a dramatically different future. The ascent of Constantine signified a pivotal moment in Roman history. Under his rule, the empire officially adopted Christianity, a new capital was established in the east, and there was an increased centralization of imperial authority. To fully grasp Constantine's influence, we must first explore the narrative of his unexpected rise from a little-known soldier to the emperor of the Romans. Constantine was born circa 272 AD in Nisus, present-day Serbia. His father, Constantius, served as an officer in the Roman army and would eventually achieve the rank of Augustus under Diocletian's tetrarchy. Constantine's mother, Helena, came from humble beginnings, and there were whispers suggesting she had once worked in a tavern. Nevertheless, Constantine's pedigree would be overshadowed by his own drive and military prowess. As a youth, he distinguished himself as a soldier in Diocletian's court within the Eastern Empire, quickly gaining recognition as a valiant and adept fighter. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, Constantius ascended to the position of Augustus of the Western Empire. At this point, Constantine, now in his early 30s, anticipated being named his father's Caesar, but he was instead overlooked in favor of a figure named Severus. Undeterred by this disappointment, Constantine decided to wait for the right moment. When his father passed away in Britain in 306 AD, Constantine was by his side. The army promptly declared Constantine as Augustus, though this designation was not acknowledged by Galerius, the senior Augustus in the east. Galerius appointed Severus as Augustus of the West and bestowed the title of Caesar upon Constantine. It was a precarious situation with multiple contenders competing for dominance. The ensuing years unfolded as a complex tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and conflicts. As Constantine worked to solidify his rule, he allied himself with Maxentius, the offspring of Maximian, a former Augustus who had been compelled to resign alongside Diocletian. Together, they managed to vanquish and eliminate Severus. Yet this alliance quickly deteriorated, leading Constantine and Maxentius to become fierce adversaries. In 312 AD, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation between the two. While Maxentius fortified his position in Rome with a more extensive army, Constantine commanded a smaller force from the north. However, as Constantine advanced toward Rome, he received a vision that would alter the trajectory of history. Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, recounts that the emperor beheld a luminous cross in the sky above the sun, accompanied by the phrase, "In this sign, conquer." Motivated by this revelation, Constantine instructed his troops to inscribe the Christian symbol of the Chi-Rho, the initial two letters of Christ in Greek, onto their shields. When the forces clashed at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, situated just beyond Rome, Constantine triumphed. In his effort to escape, Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River. Constantine entered Rome in glory, and the Senate elevated him to the status of senior Augustus. The Battle of Milvian Bridge was a crucial turning point, not only for Constantine, but for the empire as a whole. It signified the start of Constantine's acceptance of Christianity, which would lead to significant repercussions. In 313 AD, he convened with the Eastern Emperor Licinius, and they jointly issued the Edict of Milan, which established religious tolerance across the empire and halted the persecution of Christians. Over the following decade, Constantine methodically solidified his authority and eliminated his competitors one by one. By 324 AD, he had defeated Licinius and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. This newfound freedom allowed him to realize his vision of a Christian empire. In 325 AD, he called for the First Council of Nicaea to address disputes concerning the nature of Christ and to define orthodox Christian doctrine. Yet, one of Constantine's most enduring contributions was the establishment of a new capital in the east. He selected the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which was strategically positioned on the Bosphorus Strait. In the subsequent 6 years, the city underwent a remarkable transformation, with enhancements to its defences, the construction of new public buildings and churches, and an influx of artistic masterpieces from across the empire. In 330 AD, during a grand ceremony, the city was formally named Constantinople, serving as the new Rome. This founding signified an acknowledgement that the empire's centre was moving toward the east. While Rome would continue to serve as a ceremonial capital, Constantinople was poised to become the new epicenter of imperial authority. It was a bold decision, one that focused on the empire's future rather than its historical roots. Upon his death in 337 AD, Constantine became the first emperor to be baptized while on his deathbed, leaving behind an empire notably transformed from the one he had received. Christianity had emerged as the dominant faith, the imperial capital had shifted eastward, and power was more concentrated than ever within the emperor's control. Nevertheless, he also left a significant challenge, a lack of a clear succession strategy. Constantine's death ignited yet another series of civil wars as his sons and nephews vied for dominance over the empire. The cohesive entity that he had crafted would not endure long past his passing. By 395 AD, less than 60 years after his death, the empire officially divided into eastern and western segments, never to be unified again. As we enter the final stages of the Western Empire, we encounter a realm that has become a mere echo of its former glory. Plagued by invasions and drained by relentless warfare and internal strife, the once formidable Roman Empire in the West was now caught in a phase of irreversible decay. The landscape of the 5th century was marked by an empire struggling to maintain its previous status as a dominant power. Instead, it was battling for its existence amid a multitude of barbarian kingdoms. As the 5th century began, the Visigoths, a faction of the Gothic tribes, were on the move. They had been driven westward by the Huns, a brutal nomadic group originating from Central Asia, and were now advancing towards the empire's Danubian borders. In 401 AD, under the leadership of King Alaric, the Visigoths launched an invasion of Italy. The Western Emperor Honorius, safeguarded behind the marshes and fortifications of Ravenna, struggled to mount an adequate defense against them. For the ensuing decade, Alaric and his Visigoths roamed the Balkans and Italy, oscillating between clashing with and serving alongside the Roman army as federati, or allies. The distinction between invader and mercenary had grown increasingly ambiguous. In 408 AD, with the empire preoccupied by inner power struggles, Alaric saw his opportunity. He led his forces to the very gates of Rome and laid siege to the city. It had been centuries since a foreign army had besieged Rome. The shock and fear of its inhabitants must have been unimaginable. The once impregnable capital, the epicenter of a colossal empire, was now at the mercy of a barbarian ruler. After months of siege and negotiations, Alaric eventually lifted the blockade in exchange for an enormous ransom of gold and silver. However, this was merely a temporary stay of execution. In 410 AD, following further political machinations and unfulfilled promises by the Romans, Alaric's patience finally waned. This time, when he advanced on Rome, he conquered the city through force. For 3 days, the age of Constantine marked a significant turning point in Roman history. Constantine's ascent to power followed a tumultuous period of civil discord and warfare that had fractured the empire. Born in the province of Moesia to a military officer, Constantine found himself well placed for a life of imperial duty. He embarked on his career as a soldier, serving in the court of the Eastern Emperor Diocletian. Yet, fueled by ambition, Constantine soon set his sights on greater accomplishments. In the year 312, Constantine advanced into Rome to confront his adversary Maxentius. Just before the pivotal clash at Milvian Bridge, it's said that Constantine experienced a vision. According to the tale, he observed a cross of light shining in the sky above the sun, accompanied by the words, "In this sign conquer." Motivated by this celestial revelation, Constantine instructed his soldiers to emblazon their shields with the Christian emblem of the Chi-Rho, which represents the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. That day, Constantine's forces emerged victorious, and he attributed his success to the Christian God. This event marked the onset of Constantine's endorsement of Christianity, a faith that had previously faced intense persecution within the Roman Empire. In 313, merely a year after the battle at Milvian Bridge, Constantine convened with his eastern counterpart, Licinius, and together they issued the Edict of Milan. This landmark declaration established religious tolerance throughout the empire and legalized Christianity for the first time. Nevertheless, Constantine's acceptance of Christianity was influenced by factors beyond his personal conviction. It also served as a cunning political strategy. By aligning himself with this expanding faith, Constantine aimed to unify the splintering empire under a fresh religious identity. He began to allocate state resources for the building of churches and offered Christians elevated roles within the government and military. Simultaneously, funding for pagan temples was reduced, and their sway gradually diminished. Perhaps the most prominent indicator of Constantine's new Christian empire was the establishment of a new capital city in the east, Constantinople. Situated along the Bosporus Strait, this new Rome was envisioned as a magnificent testament to Constantine's authority and a symbol of Christian prosperity. The city was embellished with churches and public structures adorned with Christian iconography, serving as a powerful visual reminder of the evolving spiritual landscape of the empire. Constantine was baptized on his deathbed in 337, becoming the first Roman emperor to accept Christianity. By the time his reign concluded, Christianity had transformed from a marginalized and persecuted faith into the most influential religion within the empire. This incredible shift had far-reaching implications for the future of Rome and the entire Western world. Yet Constantine's legacy was not solely one of success. His conversion to Christianity also planted the seeds for future strife and division. Theological disagreements about the essence of Christ would ignite intense conflicts and even violence among various Christian groups. Furthermore, the privileged position afforded to the Church would forge a formidable new entity in Roman politics, which many emperors would find challenging to govern. Additionally, Constantine's choice to establish a new capital in the east would hasten the fragmentation of the empire. Following his death, authority was distributed among his 3 sons, who quickly devolved into disputes and civil war. The empire eventually regained unity under Constantine's son, Constantius II, but the rifts were already becoming apparent. The Western Empire, centered in Rome, was increasingly troubled by barbarian invasions and economic distress, while the eastern territories flourished in strength and influence. The era of Constantine marked the final moments of a cohesive Roman Empire. The prospect of a single emperor governing the entire Mediterranean world would not occur again. The balance of power was gradually shifting eastward, and the ancient deities of Rome were slowly yielding to the new Christian faith. It was a period of significant transformation and turmoil as the old world order crumbled, giving rise to a new one. As we have observed, the decline of Rome resulted from a myriad of factors: political, military, economic, and religious, rather than a singular cause. The empire had been gradually deteriorating for hundreds of years, its base weakened by corruption, civil unrest, and outside dangers. However, in the 4th century, these challenges would reach their peak, paving the way for the concluding chapter of Roman history. In the following segment, we'll observe how the barbarian groups that had long threatened Rome's frontiers would ultimately breach its defenses, unleashing a wave of devastation that would eradicate the final remnants of the Western Empire. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns, names that still evoke a sense of primal dread, would emerge as the new rulers of the Roman realm, establishing kingdoms of their own from the ashes of the once mighty empire. This narrative entails both brutality and turmoil, yet it also embodies resilience and renewal. For as the Western Empire crumbled, the Eastern Empire would persist, safeguarding Rome's legacy for another millennium in the magnificent city of Constantinople. Additionally, the barbarian realms of the West would eventually give rise to the nations of medieval Europe, merging Roman and Germanic customs into a fresh amalgam. Therefore, as we progress into the concluding sections of our tale, remember that Rome's downfall was not the conclusion, but instead a fresh commencement. The world that arose from the ruins of the empire would vastly differ from its predecessor, yet it would be profoundly influenced by the lasting impact of Roman culture, law, and religion. Even now, over 1,500 years since the last Western emperor was ousted, we continue to exist under the profound legacy of Rome, the eternal city that shaped human history like no other. The delicate ties that had kept the Western Roman Empire united for so long were rapidly coming undone. As the legion struggled to fend off successive waves of barbarian attacks, the political climate in Ravenna, the western capital, became increasingly desperate. In the shadowy corridors of the imperial palace, a young boy sat uneasily on a throne that seemed disproportionately large for him. Romulus Augustus, mockingly referred to as Augustus or Little Augustus, had been crowned as emperor in 475 AD at the tender age of just 14 or 15. However, the genuine authority over the Western Empire rested in the hands of Romulus's father, a general named Orestes. Orestes found himself in a precarious position, a Roman presiding over an empire that was only Roman in title. The army was now predominantly composed of Germanic federati, barbarian mercenaries who enlisted to fight for the empire in return for land and tribute. It would ultimately be these mercenaries that would bring about the downfall of Orestes and his unfortunate son. In 476, the federati confronted Orestes with a bold request. They aimed to settle permanently in Italy, the very heart of the Western Empire. Orestes refused outright. He insisted that Italy must remain in Roman control, even as the remainder of the empire disintegrated around it. Yet Orestes gravely misjudged the federati and their ambitious leader, Odoacer. Odoacer was a Germanic warrior from the Heruli tribe. Rising through the ranks of the Roman army, he had become a formidable general. When Orestes denied the federati land in Italy, Odoacer seized his chance. Rallying his loyal troops, he advanced on Ravenna, intent on taking by force what had been denied through negotiation. Outnumbered and desperate, Orestes abandoned the capital and sought refuge in the strategic city of Pavia. However, there would be no sanctuary for the father of the last Western emperor. Odoacer pursued him relentlessly, besieging Pavia and quickly overtaking the city. Orestes was yanked from his hiding spot and executed without delay, his blood marking the final remnants of Roman authority. With Orestes dispatched, Odoacer set his sights on Ravenna and the young emperor Romulus Augustus. The boy ruler posed no threat to Odoacer. Indeed, he resembled more of a tragic figure, much like a child donning their father's clothing. Odoacer had no intention of causing harm to the boy. Rather, he simply ousted Romulus and ushered him into a quiet retirement in Campania. The era of the last Western Roman emperor concluded not with a dramatic flourish, but rather with a soft sigh. Odoacer had now established himself as the sole ruler of Italy. He opted against declaring himself emperor. After all, what was the point of embracing a title that had ceased to hold any significance? Instead, he assumed the title of Rex Italiae, King of Italy. He dispatched the imperial insignia of the deposed Romulus to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, accompanied by a message indicating that the West no longer needed a distinct emperor. The Western Roman Empire was no more. For nearly a century thereafter, historians would still reference a separate Western Empire. However, this was merely a matter of semantics, a faint echo of former splendor. In truth, Odoacer's rise signified the genuine conclusion of Roman authority in the West. The barbarian warlord, who had once been a mercenary for Rome, now occupied the throne of Italy, while the imperial court in Ravenna faded into myth and legend. Odoacer would govern Italy as a relatively stable and prosperous kingdom for 13 years. His rule in many respects mirrored that of his Western imperial predecessors. He utilized the established Roman bureaucracy and infrastructure, minted coins bearing his name, and engaged in negotiations with the Eastern Empire as a nominal subordinate, much like those who came before him. Nevertheless, Odoacer ultimately remained a barbarian king, not a Roman emperor. His ascent to power represented a fundamental alteration in the political landscape of the Mediterranean. The last remnant of Roman legitimacy had been stripped away, exposing the stark reality that genuine political and military influence was now firmly in the realm of the Germanic warlords, who had previously been dismissed as uncouth savages. Thus, the downfall of Romulus Augustulus and the rise of Odoacer marked a pivotal moment. The time had finally come for the grand narrative of ancient Rome to reach its long-awaited finale. While the eternal city would persist, so too would the eastern half of the empire overseen from the distant city of Constantinople. Yet the aspiration for a unified Mediterranean realm, intertwined by Rome's laws and legions, had ultimately faded into mere nostalgia and fantasy. The Western Empire had ceased to exist, marking the transition from the prolonged twilight of late antiquity to the bright beginnings of a new epoch, the Middle Ages. This would be an era marked by significant transformation and turmoil, wherein the established truths of classical civilization would be uprooted and supplanted by emerging powers, new faiths, and alternative perspectives on existence. Monks and knights within medieval Christendom would nostalgically regard ancient Rome as a golden era of unmatched strength and luxury. Meanwhile, the Muslim caliphs who conquered the southern and eastern coasts of the Mediterranean would consider themselves the legitimate successors to Rome's imperial majesty. Despite the many centuries that distanced them from the ancient past, the people of the Middle Ages could never fully escape the influence of Rome. The language of Latin, the artistic and architectural styles of the Romans, the legal frameworks established by Justinian and Theodosius, and the vision of a divinely ordained universal empire, all of these elements would profoundly and persistently shape the medieval landscape, even as the political realities of the Roman Empire receded further into the annals of legend. In a way, it seems fitting that the Western Roman Empire met its end under a ruler named Romulus. As ancient lore recounts, it was another Romulus who laid the foundations of Rome approximately 1,200 years earlier. This founder, Romulus, the first king, constructed his city upon the 7 hills and filled it with fugitives and outcasts. Thus, with the abdication of Romulus Augustulus, the tale had come full circle. The kingdom of Romulus concluded with the reign of another Romulus, completing the cycle. Of course, the underlying causes of Rome's decline were intricately more complicated than just the saga of 2 Romuli framing the narrative. Throughout our exploration of the Roman Empire's gradual descent, we have examined the numerous elements that led to the slow disintegration of this unparalleled superpower. Economic turmoil, political dishonesty, religious discord, and barbarian invasions all contributed to the colossal downfall of Rome. However, the key takeaway from this historical arc might be quite straightforward. No empire, regardless of its grandeur or longevity, is immortal. Every powerful dominion faces its eventual twilight. This reality ties the collapse of Rome to the rise and fall of countless other empires across history, from the ancient realms of Persia and China to the colonial entities of the early modern times. From the British Empire at its Victorian peak to the United States in the 21st century, similar patterns are observable repeatedly. Prosperity invites complacency, power invites corruption, expansion invites overstretch. While the greatest empires may take ages to crumble, they ultimately do so without fail. The decline of Roman authority in the West represented a crucial juncture in the overall narrative of human history. It delineated the transition between the classical and medieval eras, the pivot that connected the realms of Caesar and Cicero to those of Charlemagne and William the Conqueror. The centuries that followed the fall of Rome witnessed profound transformations in all facets of Western civilization, from art and architecture to religion and politics, and even to language and literature. Still, the eternal city persisted, emerging from its early medieval period to reclaim its status as a center of influence and culture. The Rome of the popes and the Renaissance was, in numerous respects, markedly distinct from the Rome of Augustus and Trajan. Yet, it remained undoubtedly Rome, an active connection to the lost realm of antiquity. Ultimately, it is likely this lasting heritage that most significantly shapes Rome's role in the narrative of human civilization. Long after the last emperor had relinquished his rule, and long after the aqueducts and theatres had fallen into disrepair, the essence of Rome continued to thrive. The aspiration for a universal civilization, one united through law and education, shared values, and a collective history, persisted. Thus, as we say goodbye to Romulus Augustulus and the dwindling fragments of the Western Empire, we can't help but feel a profound respect for the immense scale and brilliance of Roman accomplishments. Despite its imperfections and contradictions, and in light of the violence, labor, and oppression that marked its ascent and decline, nothing has ever been quite like Rome, either before or after. It constituted and still constitutes a pivotal moment in human history, the very turning point around which the destinies of nations and peoples have frequently revolved. As we drift into slumber, our thoughts filled with visions of marble columns and imperial purple, of barbarian warlords and banished boy emperors, we may find some reassurance in realizing that the tale of Rome reflects the story of all humanity. It narrates how a humble, muddy settlement on the banks of the Tiber rose to dominate the globe, only to be undermined by the very weight of its own magnificence. It acts as a reflection of our hopes and fears, as well as the successes and struggles of our civilization. And so, during the peaceful hours of night, let us envision Rome as it once was, a city that can never be again, a realm of gods and emperors, glory and excess, unmatched power and beauty in human history. Let us wander through its ancient avenues and wonder at its eternal splendor. Even as we softly bid farewell to the last flicker of the Western Empire, may we cherish the idea of Roma as an everlasting entity. The economic difficulties that had been developing for centuries finally reached a breaking point in the 3rd century AD. The silver denarius, which had served as the backbone of Roman currency for nearly 5 centuries, began to lose its integrity. In a desperate bid to maximize the limited supply of silver, emperors started to incorporate less valuable metals like bronze and copper into the mix. Under Emperor Caracalla in the early 200s AD, the silver content of the denarius plummeted to merely 50%. By 250 AD, it had dropped to an astonishing 5% silver. What was once a respected denarius had become little more than a bronze coin superficially coated in silver. Think about the public's diminishing trust as they witnessed their currency devaluing right before their eyes. This led to rampant inflation. With an influx of coins but no corresponding increase in tangible worth, prices soared. A measure of Egyptian wheat, which used to cost 7 drachmas, skyrocketed to an astonishing 120,000 drachmas by the end of the 3rd century. Everyday expenses spiraled out of control. This economic meltdown occurred simultaneously with a period of political turmoil known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century or the Imperial Crisis. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 individuals held the title of emperor, predominantly through violent usurpation rather than peaceful transitions. In a span of 50 years, there was only one emperor who died of natural causes, while the others were assassinated, took their own lives, or perished in battle. The average reign barely lasted 2 to 3 years. In 238 AD, an astonishing 6 emperors came and went in a single tumultuous year. With such chaos at the helm, effective governance was nearly impossible. Taxation, infrastructure maintenance, and frontier defense descended into disorder. One of the most catastrophic events occurred in 260 AD under Emperor Valerian. Valerian led his legions east to face the emerging threat of the Sasanian Persian Empire. However, in a stunning act of humiliation, the Persians outmaneuvered him and captured the emperor himself as a prisoner of war. Just imagine the damage to Roman prestige. Their emperor, once a formidable leader believed to be a living deity, had now become a prisoner in Persia, never to see his realm again. Some narratives even assert that following Valerian's demise, the Persian monarch Shapur II utilized the emperor's corpse as a footstool and displayed his preserved skin as a trophy. Such was the decline of Rome's grandeur. The consequences of this extraordinary calamity rippled across vast distances. With no centralized power to maintain order, local commanders seized control for themselves. The GIC Empire split off in the west, asserting dominance over Britain, Gaul, and Spain. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire asserted authority over the vital territories of Syria and Egypt. These breakaway empires posed a challenge to Rome's supremacy for a decade and a half. It was akin to the United States today losing jurisdiction over California and Texas, resulting in their effective independence. The Roman Empire's era as the uncontested ruler of the Mediterranean was at an end. Yet, the crisis of the 3rd century revealed that the imperial structure was not invulnerable to failure. Weaknesses in its political framework, economic stability, and military strength could bring even the mightiest superpower crashing down. Although the empire would persist in some form for another 200 years, many historians mark this crisis as the onset of Rome's irreversible decline. It would require a leader of extraordinary talent to mend the ancient empire and strive to guide it along a more secure course. Luck would be on Rome's side as the individual prepared to accept this daunting mission was already in waiting, ready to don the imperial attire. His name was Diocletian, and he would implement reforms that were the most comprehensive the Roman realm had ever seen. Coming from a modest background in the province of Galatia, around 244 AD, few could have foreseen that Diocletian would ascend to rulership over the empire. He set off on his ascent, much like other ambitious figures of the time, through a military career. Distinguishing himself through his bravery and strategic skill, Diocletian served in the elite cavalry and became part of the imperial bodyguard. Nevertheless, Diocletian's true break came when his benefactor, General Numerian, died under enigmatic circumstances during a Persian campaign in 284 AD. With the powerful military's support, Diocletian declared himself emperor and swiftly dealt with any contenders. At the age of 40, this former scribe had risen to dominate the Roman world. Diocletian wasted no time in putting his vision into action. Understanding that the empire had expanded to such a size that it was unwieldy for one individual to manage, he implemented a structure known as the tetrarchy, or rule of 4. The empire would be divided into eastern and western regions, each administered by a senior emperor called an Augustus, and a junior emperor referred to as a Caesar. The two Augusti, Diocletian in the east and Maximian in the west, would serve as co-emperors with equal authority. The two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, would focus on military operations at the front and were intended to become the designated successors. Upon the retirement or death of an Augustus, the Caesars would ascend to their positions and appoint new Caesars beneath them. This orderly distribution of power and succession was designed to avert the destructive civil conflicts and power struggles that had plagued the past. To enhance administrative efficiency, Diocletian also increased the number of provinces from 50 to nearly 100, organizing them into 12 dioceses overseen by vicars. While this established a more complex bureaucracy, that could potentially slow decision-making, it also allowed the imperial government to penetrate local affairs more thoroughly than ever. Diocletian aimed to tackle the severe economic issues afflicting the empire as well. Diocletian aimed to tackle the severe economic issues afflicting the empire as well. To combat rampant inflation, he issued his well-known edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. This decree established price limits on more than 1,000 different goods and services, covering everything from a pound of ivory to a lawyer's fee, and from a bag of dates to a bunch of lettuce. Breaching these price regulations could lead to the death penalty. Yet, like numerous top-down pricing initiatives in history, this decree backfired dramatically. Merchants simply opted not to sell their products at the artificially low prices, resulting in extensive shortages. A flourishing black market arose to bypass these restrictions. Ultimately, the maximum price law was unenforceable and was generally disregarded following Diocletian's rule. One of the most notorious elements of Diocletian's governance was his fervent persecution of Christians. In contrast to the localized and sporadic persecutions of previous times, Diocletian launched an empire-wide campaign to eradicate Christianity, which he perceived as a significant threat to the traditional Roman religion and its values. In 303 AD, Diocletian commanded the obliteration of all Christian texts and places of worship. Christians were stripped of their rights and excluded from government positions. The following year, all citizens of the empire were mandated to publicly offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, or risk imprisonment, torture, and execution. Disturbing accounts surfaced of Christians being thrown to wild animals in arenas, burned alive, or worked to death in mines and quarries. The extent and intensity of this massive persecution were unparalleled. Yet, far from extinguishing this emerging faith, Diocletian's attempts only strengthened the determination of Christians and produced a new generation of martyrs. In a bitter twist of fate, just a few years later, Christianity would rise to become the favored religion of the empire under Constantine the Great. Diocletian's two-decade rule concluded with his voluntary resignation in 305 AD, making him the first Roman emperor to retire from office. He withdrew to his expansive fortified residence in his homeland of Dalmatia and took up gardening in his retirement years. Far removed from the power struggles of the imperial court, the carefully crafted tetrarchy soon began to disintegrate in Diocletian's absence. The well-ordered succession plan collapsed as the various co-emperors engaged in plotting and conflict amongst themselves. It seemed that Diocletian's efforts had been futile, leaving the empire condemned to spiral back into disorder and civil strife. Yet despite the ultimate failure of the tetrarchy, Diocletian undeniably rescued the empire from disaster and provided it with invaluable time. His military achievements had fortified the borders. His reforms in administration had reinstated some degree of central authority. Even his unsuccessful economic strategies illustrated an emperor ready to take daring measures to tackle the empire's challenges. Most crucially, Diocletian redefined the emperor's role. No longer merely the first citizen bound by historical precedents, the emperor transformed into an absolute sovereign, unchallenged in his power, flamboyant in imperial purple, and adorned with a jeweled crown. His presence was revered, with each decree serving as law. This concept of sacred absolutist monarchy would persist and proliferate well beyond Rome, establishing itself as the primary model for kingship across Europe and the Mediterranean for over a millennium. In this regard, even as the empire he ruled deteriorated, Diocletian's influence on the nature of leadership loomed large in the future. Yet despite his numerous achievements, Diocletian's reign also indicated a decisive turning point for the embattled empire. The era of growth and magnificence had passed. although the immediate crisis had been temporarily resolved, the underlying fissures in the structure could no longer be overlooked. An empire that once appeared eternal was now entering its decline. The daylight dimmed on the classic Rome of marble temples and victorious parades. However, as the dusk descended, a new Rome was emerging in the east, ready to carry forth the legacy of empire in the form of Christianity. As the 4th century dawned, the groundwork was laid for the emergence of Constantinople and the establishment of the Byzantine Empire. All it required was a visionary leader to chart the course ahead. With the Western Roman Empire nearing its end, the world experienced a seismic shift. The once grand empire that spanned from the foggy borders of Britannia to the arid sands of Syria was no longer in existence. In its wake, a fragmented collection of kingdoms arose, each one eager to seize a part of Rome's heritage. What then became of the Eastern Empire, the counterpart to Rome's erstwhile formidable rule? From his illustrious capital at Constantinople, Emperor Zeno gazed apprehensively toward the west. The eastern region had managed to endure the turmoil much more effectively than its counterpart. While the Huns and Goths threatened the gates, the walls of Constantinople remained resilient. The imperial structures, economy and military were largely intact. Nevertheless, Zeno was aware that he governed from a precarious position. The Eastern Empire, although it had survived, was irrevocably changed. The era of Roman legions marching forth to broaden the empire's territories had passed. Now the emphasis was on safeguarding what was left. The Eastern emperors began turning inwards, prioritizing court intrigues and theological disputes, while the external world continued to evolve. In numerous respects, the Eastern Empire had transformed into something distinct from the version established by Augustus centuries earlier. The common language had shifted to Greek rather than Latin. The imperial cult diminished as Christianity ascended to prominence. The once formidable Senate had been relegated to a mere rubber stamp. Yet the populace remained steadfast in their Roman identity. They referred to themselves as Romans, or Romeo, even as the years passed, and the ancient empire faded into memory. For more than a millennium, the Eastern Empire, which would come to be known as the Byzantine Empire by historians, persevered. It was a journey rich with both victories and losses, periods of prosperity and immense calamities. During the reign of Justinian the Great, the empire regained a fragment of its former Western splendor, stretching from the Ukrainian steppes to the shores of Tunisia. Yet these reconquests were short-lived, undone by overstretched resources and the relentless passage of time. The Byzantines confronted adversaries from all directions: Arabs, Persians, Slavs, Normans, and Turks. They captivated the world with the magnificence of the Hagia Sophia. Time after time, the empire hovered on the verge of annihilation, only to rediscover some hidden strength to endure. However, no empire, no matter how tenacious, can persist eternally. Dynasties emerged and faded: Macedonians, Komnoi, Palaiologoi, each unable to prevent the gradual decline of the empire. The Latin Crusaders plundered the city in 1204, delivering an unimaginable humiliation from pretended allies. The Ottoman Turks steadily eroded the empire's territory, reducing what was once a powerful realm to little more than Constantinople itself. When the end finally arrived, it felt almost anticlimactic. On May 29, 1453, following a lengthy siege, the Ottomans breached the city defences. The last emperor, Constantine XI, ripped the imperial insignia from his body and plunged into battle, never to be seen again. With that, the Roman dream was extinguished. The empire that had been home to Augustus, Trajan, Constantine, and Justinian had at last encountered an adversary it could not outlast. The narrative of Rome's fall is a story of human misjudgment and chance, filled with choices made and paths not taken. It serves as a poignant reminder that even the strongest of empires can erode over time. Even after centuries since Rome's collapse, its legacy lives on in our languages, laws, and our very perception of the world. The eternal city casts a lengthy shadow. As we conclude our exploration of the turbulent final centuries of Rome, I hope this journey through ancient history has been a thought-provoking guide to your path toward dreamland. If this glimpse into the past has sparked your interest, consider subscribing to our channel. There are countless more tales waiting to be unveiled together on this soft voyage through the ages. For now, though, gently close your eyes. Allow my voice to fade into the background and drift off into visions of emperors and legions, of a world that feels both bizarre and oddly familiar. Sweet dreams.